Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Town Council meeting of the Yountville Town Council on April 5th, 2011. First, I'd like to welcome everyone that's in attendance and watching this evening. Before we have the roll call, I just wanted to thank Vice Mayor Chilton for chairing our last meeting on March 15th in my absence. And I did want to just acknowledge I'm not necessarily changing the dress code for all of us all the time, but during my travel to Australia, I had the good fortune of having lunch with the mayor of the Barossa Valley, Brian Hearn, in their fine wine country, and he was gracious enough to share a tie from the Barossa Valley with me, so I thought I would just share that all with you folks and say hello to our friends in Australia, and also my good cousins, John and Nancy, who were our great tour guides while we were in Adelaide. So thanks to those folks and the rest of our family that's over there down under. With that, if I could have the roll call, please.
Councilmember Hall.
Here.
Councilmember Moeller.
Here.
Councilmember Dornbecker.
Here.
Vice Mayor Chilton.
Here.
Mayor Dunbar.
Here. And if I could now have everyone stand and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance, and if I could just ask our Allied Council Chairperson, Ed Olson, if you could lead us in the pledge, please. Thank you, Ed, and thank you all members of the Allied Council that are here tonight. And we will be hearing from one of you shortly. Moving on to item 4, do we have any closed session report? No. Thank you. Item 5, adoption of the agenda.
Thank you, Mayor. We have two corrections for the agenda. We have agenda item 10A, Community Center Staff Report, revised page 3, changing the total from $549,905 to $461,675. And then agenda item 10D, we're removing the word technical from the staff report. It's just the advisory body.
Thank you. Any other changes, questions, or is there a motion to approve tonight's agenda?
Move to approve.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. No opposed. Moving on to item 6, public comment. So any item that's not listed on tonight's agenda, we welcome you to speak tonight. And I know that we do have at least one public comment to be heard, so please, now would be the time. And if just to remind you, if you could list your name and if you would share your address with us, that would be great. Thank you.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor and Council. I'm Bob Heiss, Veterans Home, member of the Council, and also Chair of the Buildings and Grounds Committee. We'll get to that in a moment. I have 3 things I would like to mention. We have a busy week next week. In addition to our council meeting on the 12th is our Founders Day program. That'll be at 1:30 Grant Hall. And on the 14th, the Calvet Board, who's the overseeing body of the Department of Veterans Affairs, will be there, and their meeting will start about 9 o'clock. And the most important thing, the reason we really came tonight, I have 2 flyers to hand to you that says, on the north side of Section F at 10:30 a.m., we will have the unveiling of the new signs. So we finally made it. The rain finally went away. We got a chance to put the signs in. So if I may give you a couple of flyers.
Sure. Actually, if you could just hand the town clerk and she will help distribute.
You're all cordially invited. The area will be north of Section F in the open area there, just next to the parking lot that's across the street from the swimming pool. So there's plenty of parking available. And you're all cordially invited. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any others from the public wishing to comment on anything not on tonight's agenda? No, seeing no other, I'll move on to item 7, consent calendar. And before we receive any comments or potential motion, I'll just mention on item 7C, I will be abstaining from a vote on the March 15 minutes for which I was not in attendance. Any questions or a motion on our consent calendar?
Move to approve consent calendar.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. No opposed, and my abstention noted on March 15th minutes. Thank you. Moving right on to presentations. It looks like we have no presentations. So we will continue on to item 9, public hearing. Introduction. Thank you. Introduction and first reading of ordinance number 397-11, amending the Yountville Municipal Code. Do we have a staff report, please?
Good evening. Tonight, we're presenting to you an ordinance that includes definitions, parking standards, and zoning district restrictions for the different food and beverage-related uses. And staff is proposing a few modifications to what was brought before you on February 15th, and that's in response to council comment and feedback received at that meeting. The first item are the definitions, and there are two proposed modifications. One relates to the definition for full-service restaurant, and this is in response to Mayor Dunbar's concern that the reference to a takeout counter may result in a full-service restaurant being classified as a limited-service restaurant, and that was not staff's intent, so we reworded criterion E to provide that while a full-service restaurant does not typically have a takeout window or counter, it may be included as an optional feature where takeout food is a minor and incidental component of the food service or the restaurant activity. And this modification clarifies that a full-service restaurant is primarily a sit-down facility, but that it may have limited takeout. The other modification to a definition is for mobile food vendor, and this is in response to Member Moeller's comment regarding the parking requirement if it were to locate on public property. So staff has added to the definition that a mobile food vendor may locate on public or private property, but staff notes that the town does not currently have a policy or procedure for siting on public property, and that could be the town right-of-way, adjacent to a park, or at the community center or other public property. So at present, a mobile food vendor would be limited to private property, but this definition as modified would not need to be amended if in the future the town council wishes to move forward with such a policy, and it would define such things as selecting licensing and limiting requirements for a for-profit business on public property. It would address the maximum number at any single location in town or throughout town, and would provide the siting requirements such as restrooms and parking. Related to the definition requirement is the issue of the local sourcing of grapes, and this would only apply to the wine tasting room definition, and if approved, it would require that wine be made from a minimum of 75% locally grown grapes. That would be Napa County grapes. And two members of the council raised concern with the application and enforcement if we were to have such a requirement. So in support of the proposed sourcing requirement, staff wants to introduce Napa County regulations for area wineries, ABC rules for license holders, and then the land use preferences for urban growth and uses and agricultural uses. In 1990, Napa County adopted regulations that require new wineries to use at least 75% of Napa County grapes in wines produced and labeled from Napa County. And the same requirement applies to older wineries, and those are wineries before 1990 that expand beyond the existing wine development area. And we understand there are very few that in the 20 years since this has been in place haven't been captured by the ordinance. And both the Napa County and the Napa Valley grape growers indicate that the percentage is low without knowing the exact number. So from an enforcement perspective, staff is suggesting application of a presumption that any wine that carries a Napa County label meets this standard, and based on this, the Napa County requirements. And this would work to make Yountville's requirement for wine tasting rooms consistent with Napa County's requirements for wineries. Another thing to look at are the different requirements for on or off-site tasting rooms. And an on-site tasting room is located at a winery's or a wine grower's production facility. And these generally occur in the county. And Napa County requirements limit the amount of wine tasting activity that can occur at an on-site tasting room. And this is to discourage uses such as wine tasting rooms that could displace valuable agricultural uses and are more appropriate in urban areas. And it's really based on the concept of the agricultural preserve, which is meant to prevent non-agricultural development on agricultural land. Both Napa County and all the jurisdictions within the county have agreed on the concepts of urban-centered growth, and that's centering growth in the urban boundaries. And a wine tasting room is considered an urban use. And so when located within the town's commercial zoning district, it works to protect and preserve agricultural land, and this is consistent with the town of Yountville's general plan objectives and policies for this same purpose. Off-site tasting rooms are generally located in urban areas, and ABC rules allow a wine grower to have only one off-site tasting room. So several wineries have chosen Yountville as this location, and this off-site tasting room really represents a unique opportunity to introduce and market the county's primary agricultural product within the town limits. And space within Yountville or other jurisdictions is limited by the amount of space, and particularly here in Yountville, the amount of vacant space, there often is no vacant space, and when it is, it goes quickly. So the idea is, if Yountville were to allow its commercial zones to allow wine tasting of wines that are grown in other regions, it displaces and limits the amount of space available to Napa County wineries. So by requiring that Yountville tasting rooms adhere to Napa County requirements for the sourcing of grapes, Yountville is supporting and promoting the agricultural community and the Napa County wineries. And for all these reasons, staff is proposing that we do impose a requirement for the local sourcing of grapes. Parking is another issue that I want to touch on a couple of items. One is the mobile food vendor requirement, and we had proposed that 5 spaces be provided for each vendor. And there was some concern that whether this standard would preclude a second vendor from locating in town, but staff continues to support the standard, and it's in light of the fact that we've observed high demand times at the existing taco truck, and that it's fair and reasonable to expect a use to provide the parking for the need. We're proposing a modification to the definition for limited service restaurant, and this would apply a hybrid standard of a retail standard to the net floor area and circulation for the retail use, and a restaurant standard for the indoor and outdoor seating areas. And the last item would be the bar and nightclub parking standard, and we're proposing 1 space for a building occupancy of 3. And what this does is it uses a building code occupancy standard to apply to determine the parking requirement, and it's based on a ratio, and it's a sliding scale based on whatever the assembly area or building code occupancy would be. Lastly is the issue of zoning districts and the requirements that we would apply. And since the majority of the council supported the distribution of uses when presented at the February 15th, staff is not making any proposed changes or recommendations here. And as a reminder, all commercial uses require a use permit. So within the 3 commercial zoning districts, we're proposing that any of the proposed definitions for wide and food service uses be permitted within primary commercial. Within the residential scale commercial district, we're proposing permitting limited service restaurants, wine shops, and wine tasting rooms, but restricting new full service restaurants, wine tasting bars, and nightclubs. And this is based on past council direction of which uses are appropriate adjacent to residential neighborhoods and in the residential scaled commercial district. Lastly, in the Old Town Commercial District, the proposal is to apply standards similar to primary commercial west of Washington and similar to residential scaled commercial to the east side of Washington, and that's in recognition of the residential uses on the east side. So we are proposing that, or are recommending that you approve the draft ordinance before you tonight, and we're available to answer questions.
Thank you very much. Does council have any questions of staff before we open the public comment?
Wait,
Yes,
I have a
Councilmember Hall.
disclosure to make. Is this on? I can't hear myself. I've consulted with the town attorney. He's advised me that while the discussion on the wine tasting room regulations within the town of Yountville will have no direct impact upon the operations of my employer, Cliff Lady Vineyards, to the extent that there may be indirect impacts upon my employer, these economic impacts are not significant enough under the regulations of the FPPC to result in my disqualification. At this time, I elect to participate, but I'm required to disclose that I'm an employee of Cliff Lady Vineyards, serving as its vice president of finance.
Thank you very much. Any questions specific of staff at this point? Seeing none, I will, oh, yes, sorry. Vice Mayor, sorry.
I have two questions. And maybe this is just a recollection, but if I'm looking in the ordinance, we talk about the RSC zone section, and that's in section D, I think on page 4. We talk about new, the uses that are encouraged, and then new full-service restaurants, inns, wine tasting bars, clubs, nightclubs, and other businesses that rely principally on visitors for their clientele shall not be permitted. I had thought that we had some general agreement on the concept that businesses that rely principally on visitors for the clientele that shall not be permitted should be taken out.
We've been in discussion for the residential scaled commercial district, but those proposed modifications haven't been finalized and brought before you.
Okay.
We looked at this as the regulations for food and beverage related uses, and while we recognize that that is a line that will eventually be eliminated, we're going to bring that before you when we discuss residential scaled issues exclusively. Unless you feel like it's the time to remove it now, because you've certainly voiced the opinion that the time may be ripe for elimination of that part of the sentence.
We can discuss that. My other question has to do with the parking standards for restaurants, and specifically the limited service definition. And I don't know if previous comments were either misunderstood or I made them very poorly. I actually feel like that what has come out of that discussion puts a higher burden of parking on limited service restaurants than it does on full service restaurants, because of the one space for 250 square feet of net floor area plus one space per 4 seats for all indoor and outdoor seating areas. So I had thought of that as I don't know what your intention was when we talked about that, but as an or scenario of not going in, and what I don't want to have is a business go in and put in no seating because they're going to get penalized for doing that, and it'd be much better, and then people are trying to figure out where to go.
We actually
Don't you
feel
think
that
that's
this
if
standard
it's
more closely approximates the demand that would be from the use. And the reason is what might be a limited service restaurant now is looked at in terms of a retail standard, and the entire space is counted. So that includes any food preparation, the entire space. And this standard says, well, let's look at the net area for retail. So it's eliminating all those food prep and restroom areas and only applying it to the different uses. It wouldn't apply the retail area standard to the seating area. So it's a combination of the uses and no overlapping standard, but it should more closely approximate the use.
We found that in the area where the seats are, that would be counted at 1 to 250. Seats require 15 square feet per seat, and the formula, essentially, if you counted it at 1 to 250 or by the seat, it approximates the same number.
Is the 1 to 15 square foot, is that a building code
Yes.
issue? Okay. Okay, I guess that there's, you think of a restaurant, you come in and you have some space for the, for for customers to wait and for the maitre d' and et cetera, all of that would certainly not be counted for a full-service restaurant, but in this scenario, and neither would your kitchen prep area, which would be much larger in a full-service restaurant. That wouldn't count here far. But area for ordering or customers to wait would be counted for a limited service restaurant. So that just seemed peculiar to me. I have concern that we're putting a even higher burden. I think my intention was to put a lower burden on somebody new that was going to come in, but we can talk about that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, my recommendation was going to be if we need further discussion, we should have it collectively in just a few minutes. So thank you for those questions. Any others at this point? I do want to offer, I'll open the public hearing on this item and offer an opportunity by any member of the public wishing to speak to this issue. I see nobody running to the podium. So with that, I will close the public hearing portion of this item and move on to conversation among the council. So if we would like to just use Vice Mayor's two questions as a launching point, if you'd like to continue that discussion either on either of your 2 points.
Okay. Well, I would just, based on what we said, I think that one of the goals of this entire process was to come to, shall we call, clarity and closure on the definitions of what some of these zoning districts include. And that is why that section D, I think the other businesses that rely principally on visitors for the clientele should not be permitted. I think at this point that should be taken out. I have reiterated my belief that should include wine tasting rooms, but that's not in the draft proposal. But my view is that at this point, I think that there's been at least majority agreement that is the case, but we'll find out tonight.
And I'll just ask a follow-up question to that. Is there any other language in here that would be of that category, meaning the majority of the council has expressed an interest in changing or deleting language that you are planning on dealing with at a later date? So if we deal with this one phrase now, are we leaving out other phrases or language that we still need to address in the future?
If I recall the RSC discussion at the last time it was before the council, the agreed upon items were no new restaurants in RSC, and of course, no new hotels, which is already a feature, and that language that would be removed related to visitors, relying on visitors principally. And then there was an area that merited further discussion that had to do with perhaps a list of acceptable uses in the RSC, and that's what we were going to return with. The others we had pretty well settled on, were taken care of. So yeah, there's some language in the general plan as well that would get modified at the same time for consistency with the ordinance.
So if we were to make this proposed change, and certainly it can be made when if and when a motion is made, if a council member feels that a change in this draft is appropriate, we're not precluding ourselves from dealing with additional language at a future date, certainly.
Now, as a matter of fact, we were planning on returning with that RSC item as soon as the full council is again convened. I think there's going to be member absent coming up, but after that we were going to bring it back.
Okay. And I would agree with the Vice Mayor's recollection that there was consensus to remove that language. As I just said, if a person making the motion tonight, a council member making the motion, deems it appropriate to include that change in your motion, feel free. If not, we would be voting on it as is. If you'd like to, are there any comments to that particular phrase at this point? Or we'll have the Vice Mayor address his second issue about the limited service?
So the second one had to do with this concept that my intent when I brought this up last time was to try to, the concept of doing the one space for 4 seats, I thought had the potential for discouraging some limited service restaurants that might be more takeout oriented, but also have some seating. And if you think about a very small area that might have even 10 seats or 20 seats, for example, I just think that we are putting a higher burden on limited service restaurants with that plus than full-service restaurants. So I would at least propose making the restaurant limited service and full-service requirement the same. I wouldn't add an additional burden on limited.
Or we could, one other suggestion would be to count it all as retail,
And I would,
1 to 250.
right, and I understand I think there's an argument to be made that the intensity of use is higher, which I think was part of the reason that proposal was made originally. So that was my concern.
Councilmember Mueller, did you have, thought I heard you ready to make a
No, I
comment?
just, my only comment was that I share Vice Mayor Chilton's opinion, as I've expressed before, too, about wine tasting rooms in the residential scaled commercial, so that's my only comment.
Okay. Comments, Councilmember Hall?
No, other than this actually does help in providing clarity, and I think it'll assist us in making future decisions regarding businesses and uses as they come in. At least we'll have a more well-defined way to apply any of the future applications and review of those applications. And I also think it provides that clarity to those people who might apply, which it's not just for us to make decisions based on what we believe we've interpreted. It's also assisting others in understanding how we want the town to be designed. So I think it goes to that end. But I also would agree that we've all, I believe, in a sense, discussed that one portion that the vice mayor is identifying, and perhaps we should have it excluded.
Thank you. Councilmember Dornbecker?
Well, I feel that we don't want to place an additional burden on a limited service restaurant. And if that's what this actually does achieve, I don't think that that's what the intent was, and I think we should address that. But I also feel that taking out the businesses that rely principally on visitors for their clientele shall not be permitted is language that's excessive. We can take that out.
Thank you. What I will also bring up, I am comfortable with removing that one phrase out of item D. I do feel that we've spoken to that issue, and we might as well, we know we want to clean that language up. Let's get to it. We can deal with other language in the future. I did want to address one other item in item A on page 2 in the therefores. In the mobile food vendor definition, I propose that we change the word truck to vehicle because I think it's too restrictive to trucks. And I know that we already are discussing or have in our community non-truck mobile vending, at least in the form of a pizza oven, for example. So I don't want there to be some confusion or unintended consequence to a hand cart, to a pizza oven, any other type of mobile vehicle that there'd be vague language here. So I would propose changing it just to vehicle, and I think that would be fairly all-inclusive as opposed to truck. And I realize some of the language in here is about preparing and serving food from that vehicle, but I still think that we may want to just change that language slightly there. And I appreciate the response to the percentages of local sourcing. It's not so prohibitive that somebody that has grapes coming from Sonoma as well as Napa is going to be prohibited from serving here in Yountville, but the predominant varietal the source needs to be from the Napa Valley, and I think that's a fair expectation on businesses that come into Yountville. I think I understand the intent of the language as addressed by the Vice Mayor. regarding the limited service, the way I read it, it was the combination of those two areas, not the one area and then they get hit with a whole separate area also. But if staff has a recommendation on maybe an adjustment of that language to get that clarified.
I think the best recommendation would be to, it's not really an additional burden in the sense of the interior space, because it's being counted as 1 to 250, were it not counted as seats. It's perhaps the outdoor seats that add on in an unexpected way. And if we exempted outdoor seats and just counted the indoor area as 1 to 250 or by the seat, and then leave it at that.
My other concern about that point, before the Vice Mayor speaks again, is seating that's in what we have designated as open space. And we have some tasting rooms that have seating in open space, outdoor area. We may have food service areas that have seating outside in open space areas. And if this definition would be appropriate for calculating the parking impact on having seats where somebody may now drive up, technically get food from inside the building and come outside, use that seating.
Right, and that can happen, but the conventional application or thought towards that has been they're not reserved necessarily for eating. Someone could come up and sit down, read a newspaper or whatever, and they're not exclusively for the use of the eating food bought at that restaurant or that hybrid restaurant.
Okay. Vice Mayor, did you have additional comments?
Well, I think you bring up an excellent point, which is, and I think this is where I get to the or, which one comes into play. It reminds me of the 35% FAR with your garage and 30% FAR without your garage, whichever one is more restrictive. Is you could have a very small. You could have an ice cream store, for example, that would need very little prep space, very little square footage, and then want to put 30 seats outside. So I think that the idea of doing the or, which is 1 to 4, or the size of the retail space, whichever one is more restrictive might make sense, because we're trying to get to the demands on parking. That's the real goal, and the how intensity of the usage. So I understand the intention is not to penalize, but I think it can. So I would really think that plus actually might make sense for an or, whichever one is more restrictive. Does that make sense, Bob? Do you think and I would leave the indoor and outdoor in there.
That would be fine. I think in many cases the number is going to approach about the same quantity of parking.
I think you're probably right.
What I would not want to see happen is if we make that an or, a full-service restaurant then want to be calculated by, not by their seats, but by their square footage. But as long as you're talking about the seating and the square footage for this calculation would basically be the same.
Yes, and I guess getting back to the outdoor seats and they're also serving as open space, there is that issue that they're not really exclusively for the use for eating, and anyone could sit there, generally speaking. And if we're counting at a 1 to 4, just like it was part of that operation, that may not necessarily be valid. You may want to consider that of a different ratio or discounting them.
Any comments from council on this one? We seem to be kind of focused on this one sentence here, but I think there still needs to be some discussion before we have consensus, if we're able to get to consensus. Is there any comment to that? Councilmember Hall, you inhaled, so I'm going to ask you to exhale.
Yeah, I was just trying to, in my head, and I know Steve was looking to chime in, but I was trying to, in my head, see how this could be more or less restricted. And what I hear staff saying, correct me if I'm wrong, is that either way, they're roughly equivalent.
I think the change is, right now, if we change nothing on the parking, we would be assessing the interior space at 1 to 250. And what we have found is if you do it a different way and count by the seats, put seats in that same area, it kind of comes out to the same as counting it as 1 to 250. So there's not going to be a dramatic change on the inside.
Right.
But then the new thing is we don't go outside and start counting 1 to 250 now because there's seats out there. That's a new element that is being introduced here on something that are seats in an open space area and aren't really dedicated to the food use necessarily.
Understood.
And that's the point I'm raising. If you may want to look at that and being more lenient in that way for the outdoor seats.
But the fact remains that those seats can be used
Could
by
be,
that.
yes.
So there could be a full capacity use by that business. There is that possibility. It was, and this language addresses what that full capacity parking impact would be.
Right, and what we find, though, is, of course, we're getting into the good weather, but when those seats are doing this dual open space and seating for whatever, including food use, it's very much a seasonal thing. They're typically not weather protected, like at Bouchon or elsewhere you find those. So it's they're not geared to really be used year-round and or for just the food.
Is there another comment?
And I'd like to add, if we're not going to go with this aggregate standard where we combine them, but look at the 1 to 250 square feet separately from the 1 to 4 seats, when Bob mentioned it generally equals each other, that's when we're looking at the entire space. And this is counting only the net floor area, so we would want to go back to the gross square footage of the building if it's an either or.
What I would propose right now is if a council member feels comfortable to make a motion, this is an introduction of this ordinance. There is the ability to adjust the language when we move to, assuming it's introduced, to actually accept it in the second reading. It sounds like we could go around and around about this specific language and sentence somewhat indefinitely, but if council has another thought to that point, now would be the time to share that. Councilmember Moeller?
Well, one thought, I think we just don't really have enough, I think you're bringing up some good examples, but maybe we could just take this whole thing out for now, and because it's related to parking, and we could come back and have a parking discussion and then move ahead with the rest of the resolution, because I think for additional clarity, some of the examples you're bringing up, you could put in a staff report and have more options laid out that we would maybe be prepared to talk to in more detail if it was taken out entirely and brought back.
Open to other comments from council. I think we have had conversation at some length about this item, so I'd just like to hear the other council. And at any point, a motion would be appropriate if there is such. But Vice Mayor, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I think there are I think there's some merit to what you just said, and the fact that there are, if you take a Bouchon Bakery, which is a very unique situation with very small space and a lot of seats outside.
Right.
You take my business, which is sort of in the middle. You could have one that would be the complete opposite with no outdoor space. I would say that it would make sense in a motion, at least for now, to maybe just leave it where it is now, which is at 1 per 250 square feet of net floor, or not net floor area, of floor area. Like you said, that would probably achieve about the same. And if we want to come back and change that one piece with different standards, then we could do that later. So I would support that if somebody made that motion.
Staff would also comment that since we are introducing a new definition, a new category, limited service, there is the potential that somebody will come in and apply for that, and we do need to have a parking standard with which to assess them. So taking it completely out poses potentially a problem, because some of the things that have been in play and some of the concept reviews even could end up being conceptually the new limited service restaurant that you've defined. So staff would respectfully recommend that we have at least a parking standard going forward. And I would remind you all that just like we're doing it today, if our observation down the road is that that parking standard is not working, we can come back and revisit that.
And that's why I would suggest the 1 to 250 as it is today. Okay.
Is there a motion to be presented to the council?
Can I want to, if I can make one more comment?
Vice Mayor?
One thing that was not discussed, any detail had to do with the inclusion of, in the mobile food vendors, the ability to locate on public property, that specific, I'm going to call it allowance, it was kind of silent in the past. And I do have a concern that somebody can come in and says it specifically says here on public, and then we would say, well, sorry, we have no rules, so you can't do that. So I personally don't think that public land should be used for that purpose. So I had concerns about that being included.
Well, it's a definition, and right now, citing is what your definition says what a mobile food vending vehicle is.
Okay.
It doesn't, I mean, our policy, if somebody asks right now, the town policy does not support placement on public property, so it would have to go to private. Again, that's a policy question. Staff brings up a section, we're writing the ordinance, and, the definition allows for it, defines what it is. Your policy going through that you adopted will determine whether there is such a thing as a mobile food vending on public property.
So our ordinances, the parks zoning, that's never changed to say, and it goes.
There isn't any enabling
It's just in the definition
ability.
only.
Right, just
Okay.
because the definition includes it does not mean that you have to have a policy to facilitate it.
Great, thank
And the
you.
language also says here, consent must be obtained by the property owner, which would be the town.
I understand.
Is there any other discussion, or is there a motion to be presented?
I guess I can try to make a motion on this with the following changes, that on page 2, under mobile food vendor, truck be changed to vehicle, and that on page 5, on page 4, item D, the phrase after nightclubs, comma, starting and other businesses that rely principally on visitors for their clientele shall not be permitted will be stricken. And that on item G, number 2, that we leave, or we modify that to say 1 space per 200 square feet, I believe, of net floor area. 250, square feet of net floor area. With those changes, motion to approve or introduce.
So-
Gross
Gross
floor area rather
sorry.
than net.
It says net, but you meant, it is gross. My mistake, thank you. Gross floor area.
And you're proposing to strike the rest of that?
Yes, I believe just to have that as the only condition for the limited service. Gosh, I don't even know where to start on this one. To introduce the first reading of ordinance number 397-11, amending Yountville Municipal Code Title 17, Chapter 17.08 definitions, Chapter 17.48 PC-primary commercial, Chapter 17.52 RSC residential scale commercial, Chapter 17.56 Old Town commercial, and Chapter 17.88 off-street parking and loading to create definitions for food and beverage-related uses, including wine tasting, establish zoning districts in which these uses are permitted, and provide parking standards for the defined uses.
And waive the reading. And waive the reading.
And waive the reading. Thank you. I missed that.
I'll second.
There's been a motion and a second.
Mr. Mayor, I'd like to propose an amendment to the motion. I would like to propose that the motion be amended, that Section D on page 4, where the type of businesses that are not permitted within the RSC zone to include wine tasting bars, actually includes that, I'm sorry, wine tasting definition.
Where's that?
Section D on page 4.
Could you clarify and
That the-
actually, should we be having an amendment to this motion, or should there be a completely separate second motion?
There should be a second first.
Okay, so are you proposing an alternate motion, not an amendment to this motion?
No, I'm proposing an amendment to this motion.
We would have to
We have
vote
a
on this
second.
motion first and then have an amendment to that?
There has to, if there's a second on the motion, then there can be amendment to that motion.
Okay.
The motion maker has to concur, and there has to be a second by the person that seconded the motion, if I'm not mistaken.
So the vice mayor may offer his amendment to this language, but then Councilmember Hall, as the maker of the motion, would have to approve that, as well as Councilmember Dornbecker would have to approve that language change?
Correct.
Okay. So, Vice Mayor, could you clarify what your
I will
proposed amendment is?
therefore rescind my proposed amendment, and I will propose an alternate motion that encapsulates the same language as Councilmember Hall proposed. And however, in item D on page 4, the second sentence under item D, it would read, "New full-service restaurants, inns, wine tasting bars, nightclubs, and wine tasting rooms shall not be permitted."
So you're trying to change, to exclude wine tasting from residential scale commercial is your intent? Is there a second to the amended motion?
Could I jump in one quick point here?
Yes.
If it's the council's intent to deal only with the difference between the seat in the limited service hybrid standard for parking, deal with just the area that was devoted to seats and convert it into the 1 to 250, then it would be net rather than gross. Typically, in these restaurants, half of the square footage of the gross is kitchen, and then the other half is customer areas the customers have access to. We were in this discussion talking about just the seat area being converted over into the 1 to 250, rather than, if we go gross, it's essentially doubling the entire number for the interior square footage. Is that, do you follow me on that one?
No.
Okay.
Isn't gross the existing standard, though?
Well, it's hard to, for a retail area, yes, but most, like a shop, customers have access to more of the floor area. There's maybe a little office or something. In a restaurant, half of it's taken up by kitchen and food preparation and storage areas. So just consider that if it's your intent to count everything, and we can go with the gross. But what we were discussing along the lines of is just where the customers sit, and are we going to count that per seat, or are we going to convert it over to 1 to 250? And I thought that's what the discussion was along the lines of. But to just flip it to gross, then we're counting kitchen, where the customers were seated, everything.
Well, let me just ask for an opinion of our council. We have a motion, an amended motion on the floor.
And another
Should we even be having discussion with staff at this point?
Well, there is a substitute motion, but there's not a second to the substitute motion, I don't believe. I think that we're in the process of clarifying the terms of the substitute motion when...
Which would be appropriate.
So when there was interjection by staff, so council can entertain that interjection before clarifying the substitute motion.
Thank you. I want to make sure that we could have this conversation with you. So what I don't want to, I don't think the intent of the council is to not count employee impact on the restaurant use. So if you're talking about net being only guest seating and retail, that doesn't address
That would not.
the council's concern. So we are talking gross, so that there is, and I'll let the motion and the amended motion and the second motion authors clarify their language, but that's my understanding of the council's intent, that we leave it to the original motion by Councilmember Hall that was for gross square footage, which would be the entire business, would be counted at a 1 to 250 calculation. And is that your intent?
My intent was to do based on the existing standards that we apply to restaurants. Retail.
Retail, then it would be the entire gross.
The gross. Okay, so the language that was proposed by Councilmember Hall remains as presented and as was seconded. Then there was an amendment that was rescinded And now a second motion is being proposed by the vice mayor to change the language to item D to add the prohibition of wine tasting rooms in residential scaled commercial. And that motion has been presented, and as yet there has not been a second.
I will second that.
And just to state before we get to that, I agree with the gross as well. I think the employee impact.
So your amended motion, gross,
I need a
would be appropriate.
clarification then.
okay, actually,
So-
we have a motion and a second, so now there is discussion on the secondary motion. And the difference, as I understand it from the first and the second, only pertains to the intent of the vice mayor to eliminate residential scaled commercial use by wine tasting rooms. He's looking to add the prohibition of wine tasting rooms to this zoning.
We had a long conversation about this before.
Yes. So you don't have to, I mean, you vote one way or the other based on your position on that. That would be appropriate. There has been a motion and a second, and any additional discussion we can have, or we can call a
Well,
vote.
it hasn't been seconded.
It has.
It has been.
It has.
Councilmember Moeller
That's
seconded
right.
it. There's also, we could continue this at least another go-around, that second motion could be amended to a third motion and eliminate that effort. I know the majority of the council does not support that language, but there is a motion. We'll take a roll call vote on that motion. And then if that fails, a new motion can be presented. If it is approved, then that's,
What I would suggest, Mr. Mayor, is there would be a vote on the substitute motion, and if the substitute motion fails, then the previous motion would then be
We vote on that.
appropriate to act upon.
so can we have a roll call vote on the substitute motion, which in essence is the same as the original motion, except it would exclude wine tasting rooms from residential scale commercial zoning?
Yes. Councilmember Dornbecker,
No.
Vice Mayor Chilton,
Yes.
Mayor Dunbar,
No.
Councilmember Hall,
No.
Councilmember Moeller,
Yes.
So that motion fails, and so now we will have a roll call vote on the original motion by Councilmember Hall.
Okay. Just one moment. Councilmember Dornbecker,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Chilton,
Yes.
Councilmember Hall,
Yes.
Councilmember Moeller,
No.
Mayor Dunbar.
Yes.
Motion passes.
So that motion does pass, which is the introduction and first reading of this ordinance with the noted adjustments. Does staff need any additional? Council is convinced that we got that all
That's right.
correct in the right
Yes.
order?
I agree.
Nice little test of Robert's rules. Thank you, Town Council and staff for that, and Council SEL as well as CIL on that item. With that, we will move on to administrative regular items. Item 10 on the agenda, Community Center. That's what we just say. We just say Community Center. Discussion regarding Operations and Marketing Plan update, which is a continued item from February 1, 2011.
Thank you.
Staff.
Good evening. So as you pointed out, this is a continuing of the item from February 1st, 2011, when staff brought before council an update to the community center operations and marketing plan that was previously approved in October of 2009. That conversation took several turns, and some of the discussion items were the impact of the free and reduced uses, how does the community prioritize the services, what's important to our citizens, what should revenue targets be, what is the overall cost of operating the center, how do we maximize our revenue generating opportunities, focusing our marketing on packaging, product, pricing, and promotion, and clearly defining a marketing program. Included in the staff report, I've laid out some additional information of costs of operating the center. So the first page, which is 2 of 8, community center operation. So this is the cost of operating the center and offering it as a rental facility. So the costs include full and part-time personnel for managing, operating, and maintaining the community center, including some public works staff time as well. Maintenance and equipment of the center includes custodial service, regular system maintenance for things such as the cooling and heating system, solar panels, kitchen equipment, and more. Some of the costs of operating the center are variable. They include part-time personnel costs, contract maintenance for cleaning and utilities to some extent, supplies, and event insurance. So those costs vary based on the amount of rental activity that the center has. So we've broken out those costs in several categories, and you see that they total $279,000 and some change. On page 3 of 8, I've broken out the community center costs for programming and administrative expense. So these are the costs of offering our programs, events, and services at the community center. So they include the personnel costs for full and part-time staff, contract services for things like bus rentals, payments to our contract class instructors, our allocated overhead, insurance, advertising, and employee training. Again, some of the costs of offering programs and events and services are variable, and those include part-time personnel, supplies, the contractor instructor payments, and equipment rental. So obviously those costs fluctuate based on enrollment and are directly tied to the revenue being generated with program registration or sponsorships of events. For example, the majority of our leisure classes are provided with the contract instructor. So the instructor enters into an agreement with the town where the town receives a percentage of all program registration funds. So as you see, I've broken out again into several categories, and the costs of programming the center total in administration of $461,675. So that was the amended paperwork.
Yeah, and I just wanted to clarify that in case anybody joined us late, that total was amended from the original report. So the 461,675 is the corrected
total
amount.
for that page.
Thank
yes.
you.
On page 4 of 8, I've combined them so the total expenses that are budgeted for the Yountville Community Center, and that's everything that we've just discussed, totaling $740,785. And I just wanted to also show 26% of that total is the variable expenses that I've discussed. So they fluctuate with program enrollment and rental activity. And the other 74% are set expenses at this time, which include operating and staffing the center. So expenses such as allocated overhead of liability insurance, full-time staffing, and benefit costs and maintenance are pretty much set costs. Variable expenses, as I discussed, part-time staffing and benefits, supply costs, expenses, cleaning, are vary with our enrollment and also our rental activity. So I wanted to also point out and bring special attention to the free and reduced rate rentals. So within the fee structure that council approved in 2009 for the community center, there is free and reduced rental rates for local nonprofits. Our local Yountville-based nonprofits receive 2 free uses a year and then a nonprofit rate thereafter. So in 2010, we had 28 free uses and another 14 at the nonprofit rate. We also had offer a 46% discount to residents, and we served 8 residents at the discounted rate, an additional 20 customers at market rate. So the free rental uses at the community center totaled over $35,000 in support from the town if that was equated at the market rental rate. And I've listed the organizations that utilize that service. So local nonprofit agency rental totaled over $12,000 in support from the town. And that, again, is based on what it would equate to at the market rental rate. And resident use discounted total equated to $6,500 in support from the town. So totaling almost $60,000 in support for those free and reduced rental rates is what the town offered last year in its fee structure. So if that was equated in market rate, it would be about $60,000. So staff has been looking at areas for increased revenue and cost recovery. We're looking at increasing our market rate weekday rentals. We've looked at potentially adding 8 of those during the year, and the cost, the earning potential associated with that. we'll be bringing forward a commercial rate rental fee structure to you to also take a look at, to try and host some potential trade shows or things that are based out of the community center with the idea of profiting from it. We're also looking at, and that's why I brought that forward to you, evaluating the resident and nonprofit rates. We're looking at renting the commercial kitchen to chefs. That's an area that we're quickly analyzing right now. As far as the community needs assessment and pricing structure and balancing our services and private rentals and looking at how we get a feel for what our community is looking for from us, and the marketing plan. So I go through some information in here as well on that. But I just wanted to really bring it back to the strategic plan that you just approved for the final today. And I wanted to let you know and make sure to draw attention to the fact that the majority of those things that we were talking about in our previous meeting that came up are things that we've outlined in the strategic plan, and there's a timeline associated with it. So the 5-year department plan, a marketing plan, the community center plan, a cost recovery and pricing philosophy is all included within our strategic plan, but there's timelines associated with that. So I feel that I would love to entertain any more information and input that you'd like to give. The staff is currently looking and researching at ways in the short term to do a lot of the research and put some plans together for the short term. But more definite plans are outlined in the strategic plan. So, for example, the marketing plan for the department will be completed in this fiscal year or the next fiscal year, 11-12, and so on. So I'm here, obviously, and Lisa Tyler to answer any questions and receive any feedback that the council would like to give. Thank you.
Thank you for your report. Questions from council? Councilmember Dornbecker.
I do have a question for you, Sam. Who owns the computers that are in the library?
The county, the library.
The county
Napa
owns
City
those?
County Library, yes.
And I saw in two places, one place where in the budget negotiations, we had last year decided to not give grants to any of the nonprofits in town anymore, community-related nonprofits anymore. But is it something that we decided to make up for by offering them 2 free rentals in the community center?
Actually, I'll take that one from a historical perspective. No, I think what this shows is the town, the answer to your question first is last year the council made a policy decision that would be our last year of funding the then community grants program. So there are agencies that are and entities still receiving that funding in this current fiscal year, but that beginning with the upcoming fiscal year, that program will end. We've been doing that and providing the community center fee reduction, and that's one of the things that we really wanted to identify was I don't think the community recognizes the value of the town's contributions in that regards, and when you look at it, that's a fairly substantial contribution and investment in the community nonprofits, and we just need to do a better job of marketing that, but also recognizing that when we allow those very valuable community fundraisers, events, and activities going on, it's that schizophrenia that I talked about. We're giving away something, and at the other end, I'm asking Sam and Lisa to come up with a revenue stream that's going to be X. And that's why we're looking at trying to understand how much we give away, which is fine. I mean, it is an investment. We just have done a bad job of communicating that to our community-based groups. There is a sense of entitlement in the case of some, but also showing people we are making a significant investment that supports our nonprofit. And as we start looking at how do we put pricing and various cost recoveries, it's a element, not just, there's many pieces that go into operating the community center. And, you know, one of the neat things for us that's a challenging one is, you know, community is part of the community center. You know, it's not a rental facility, it's a community center. So we have the challenge of bringing classes, programming, activities, as well as community-based and our nonprofit activities. So we don't quite operate on the same revenue target of a private sector business.
I had another question, please, and that is, in the community center programming and administrative expenses, Sam, would you please tell me again the difference between the allocated costs and the instructor contracts and rentals, et cetera?
Sure. The allocated overhead are things like our computer system, our phones, our technology. We have allocated insurance, liability insurance. We have allocated OPEB contribution. So all of those things that are broken out with Kathleen's magical system and then are allocated out to each department. So the supplies, contracts, rentals are really something that touches each program, and it's based on that. So whether we rent a bus, we rent the movie screens, we buy paper.
I understand. Thank
Okay, you're welcome.
Thank you for your questions. Other questions of staff? Councilmember Hall?
Just a couple of quick comments. So thanks for the information, and I mean this helps a lot in sort of understanding what the potential or the opportunity is with the community center and recognizing community in the word center. It's not a facility or a rental facility for us to have the barn dance every Friday night on the weekends. I get that. That said, I think that what you brought to the table with regards to targeting some opportunities, looking at potential commercial events, looking at a strategy, or at least putting a number out there to say, we'd like to see if we can find some weekday rentals. It gives a sense, as someone who is looking at what we spend, which I think on the page was $741,000, and I grant there's a lot of community investment that's going into it. It gives a sense that at least we're making a tactile approach to generate some income to offset the costs. It's a wonderful facility. I live on the street, so I'm glad to drive by it every day, and it's an investment in the beauty of the town. I recognize that too. One thing that you might consider, I'm not saying you go off and do any homework on this, but what's really interesting about like a commercial event, and we're going to have an event here which is a nonprofit, but it'll bring some commercial activity to the rest of the town, is how much income does that generate for the local businesses, and in turn generating sales tax for the rest of the community, especially if you have a commercial event where it's going to be here overnight or on a weekend, and they're going to generate hotel revenue. Kathleen can do the magic with her pen on what our TOT is, and that again goes back to supporting all of the activities in the community, including the community center. So this is helpful. It gives a sense that we have some targets and objectives we can go after, and it was good to read through it. So I appreciate the effort that was into it.
Thank you.
So we are really still, and I appreciate your comments, we really are still accepting questions of staff right now, and then
I guess so.
You're on the record now.
My question
if
is:
you have a question?
Do you know roughly what that generates in income whenever you bring in a commercial activity through the rest of the town? Has anyone ever tried to quantify that?
We're working on that. So I've looked at a couple different systems that have been used in other agencies, mostly focusing on sporting events. So a lot of municipal agencies look at softball tournaments as an example. So getting their system and equating it here, we're working on it.
I would say anecdotally, and I'm going to say that just that, it is anecdotally. Right now, our largest midweek type use tends to be local, community-based, governmental, and nonprofits. For example, the Vintners Association, the Grape Growers, County Probation Department. So while those are having potentially some positive impact on catering, restaurant, they're not having an impact on room revenue because they're primarily local because of our location. Having said all that, that's still a very attractive business market segment for us to move forward with. We are also working on some outreach with the hotels to try to coordinate when they have an event that needs to use some space, how that, and we can probably track that and identify something. But right now, I would say we have not, short of some of the private sector weddings and special events that way, there's probably been a nominal impact on the overnight TOT. Catering, and it's probably a wide range of catering opportunities from both the local Yountville and outside of the area, because we have an open catering policy that allows, restaurants and other establishments and independent caterers to come.
Thank you. Any other questions from council to staff at this point? Councilmember Mueller, a question?
Just some clarification on the Alzheimer's Association. Is this a local Napa County association, or is this the
It is
United
the-
States of Alzheimer's Association?
It's the Napa Solano agency. So there's districts for that association. It's the Napa Solano that serves our community.
Okay.
And there's a
Thanks.
couple of things that we've done on some of these. With some of our partnerships, we've also required that they will provide something to the community. For example, with the gardeners, we've required them to open some of their programs to the public and include that and do some things. So we've also been able to leverage some of these discounted rates with additional community-based programming that we wouldn't have got otherwise.
So there are qualifications to be classified as a local nonprofit,
Correct, and we
not
have a
purely
It's defined
based
as
in
serving.
the town limits.
Yeah, defined as serving the Yountville community.
Right. Thank you. Any members of the public would like to comment on this item this evening? No? Thank you. Thank you for being here. But I'll bring this back for additional council discussion if there is any. Since we received questions, now we're looking for additional comments and direction for staff. Vice Mayor, would you like to share your comments?
Sure, I would reiterate the earlier comment/questions of Councilmember Hall. I think there's a lot of good information here, and thank you for following up on that. I guess this is actually a question in the comment time. I don't know if I should do that. The way you've split out the expenses, I hope that this is the way we see it in the budget as well, so we can see that revenue expected from each of those areas. I think that would be very useful because it does break it down in a very logical manner.
Yeah, the Parks and Recreation Department budget will look quite a bit different to you this year. So you'll see things, our 5 accounts split into 8. I got Kathleen to 8.
Oh, good.
No. But it does,
A long
it's very
negotiation, I'm
clear
sure.
to actually tracking the program expenses into smaller categories and then the rental expenses as well. And then with that, the allocation of administrative overhead, such as me and, Jennifer and the staff, is split even farther to more give you an accurate reflection of really what the true cost recovery is in each area. So that will look quite a bit different to you this year.
Excellent. All right. And I appreciate staff bringing forth the comments about the value to nonprofits, the value to our community. It is a community center, and I think that's very important, and it's part of what makes the community center. I think most people in town, most of the events they actually go to are probably those events. So I think it's great, and we should certainly continue that. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Dornbecker, any additional comments?
I just want to add, this was very helpful and really laid it out, and I can see the areas that you've identified. I encourage you to go after those, and I know it's a very challenging time, but I think you're doing a wonderful job.
Thank you. Councilmember Moeller, any final thoughts on this?
Also, I'd just like to reiterate pretty much what all the other council members, I think this is a good step in the right direction to give us all the information we need so that we can really help you. And I really liked how you identified the key elements of your strategic plan, which will be the business plan and the marketing and all that. So I do appreciate that there will be pieces as our immature facility matures further down the line. So, and I just wanted also to point out from kind of my number crunching, it looks like, so currently with the expenses versus the revenue, you're at about 25% of the target goal of closer to 30 or 33. I'm not sure if we were.
I think you approved 29%.
29%, so a third, so, okay, so we're getting pretty close to that, but I think, and probably when we have our budget discussions, the percent is a very valuable number for cost recovery, but I think we'll also be keeping our eye closely on the actual dollar amounts that come from the general fund, so right now, according to the discussions I had with Sam, are about 559, almost 560,000 that we're supporting. So that 30% is while that's a target, I think that's what we'll also be doing during the budget discussions, because, 30% of $1 million is a whole lot more that we'd be putting in than 30% of 500 and almost 60,000. So that's what we'll be working towards, I think, when we get to all the budget numbers. But thank you for all your help with this.
Thank you.
Councilor Hall, any additional comments?
Yeah, just one more. First of all, thanks again for all the effort on this, and I did really appreciate some of the creative ideas that you have come up for additional revenue generation, and the commercial kitchen to chefs. I do know that there is demand for that kind of activity across the valley, because we get called at my business as to whether or not people can use our kitchens for that kind of stuff. So I think there is opportunity there. I don't know how you price that kind of stuff.
Lisa's a genius.
Yeah, good. Lucky you.
From now on, recommend they call Sam.
Yeah, that's what I'll do. I'll just divert my phones to you guys.
That would be great.
That's all.
Thank you. Two things I'd like to highlight, or three actually. The first one is thank you for the response that you provided from the original council feedback on the information that we were still looking for. So thanks for putting that all together for us. One item, I still hope that we can find a farmer's market in our future to go along with this. It may not be one of these revenue generators, but I just think that it's something we keep trying every few years, and I know that you're on it, and I understand the town manager would love to comment on it. I'm just throwing the idea out there. It doesn't need discussion tonight.
Well, I'm just saying, I do have some news for you, but it's not good news.
Okay.
Because while we may not make money, the participants in the farmers market expect to make money, and we have heard from the organizers that, frankly, our volume, our purchasing, until we can, and basically I was told by one organizer that if we wanted to subsidize and provide a minimum to the participants coming, they would reconsider. Otherwise, we were considered just not a profitable venue. People did not buy.
Fair enough. Okay.
But we are continuing. I just wanted to share with you, because we have done that, and unfortunately, that's, it's not good news.
Okay.
But you will see a lot of increased use of that plaza area as we go forward.
Great. And just the last note I wanted to highlight was the community needs assessment survey, engaging the community and them providing, or all of us providing feedback on not only what we're looking for, but with the improvement in our marketing of what we have been offering and continue to offer on a free or discounted level, that comes at a cost of not generating as much revenue. And to hear the entire community's feedback, and then, again, more information for the council to make its policy decisions on where do we really want to prioritize and direct our efforts. So thank you for providing that additional feedback. With that, we will move on. And is that enough direction from council at this time?
Yeah, definitely. I'm looking forward to coming back as we proceed with the items in the strategic plan and sharing with you as we go along.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. We will move on then to item 10B, budget workshop parameter discussion for the upcoming fiscal year 2011-12. We have a staff report on that.
Yes, we do. And Kathleen and I will be sharing the presentation, and obviously there was no impact in the prior staff report relating to budget development, so we'll take some strategic look. But today what we want to talk to you about is to provide an overview of our various preliminary revenue projections as estimated by staff, and we also want to get confirmation from the council as to identify key budget parameters and assumptions and certain directions that we use when developing the draft budget to bring back to you for review. Want to point out, as was adopted earlier, this year, and you've already seen it referenced in what Sam was just discussing with the report on the community center, we will see the introduction of the town council's fiscal year 2011-16 strategic plan goals and objectives interfaced into the budget document. It will lead the budget preparation in many of our work plans and initiatives. In addition, staff continues to monitor the ever-changing dynamics of the state budget situation and what impact they may or may not have on the town of Yountville, including right now it's not moving very fast, so that makes it very hard to predict what outcome will be. One of the real concerns that's going to be a mystery to a lot of people will be the subsequent potential service realignment impacts at the local level. And these are not being discussed a whole lot in public, and there's not a lot of concrete. But if the state stops doing something and determines that the county or the local government should, we don't know what all that's going to shake out yet, and whether we're going to get reimbursed, partially reimbursed, or not reimbursed, and what change that might have. The other thing is we may see, and this is going to apply more in some of the social service, mental health, but probation. If a bunch of folks aren't getting the counseling and support services they need, they may be hanging out places like our parks, which then has an impact on public works maintenance, law enforcement, potentially increased medical costs. So I just share with you that those are some of the things that we're tracking, and I'm unfortunately going to share with you, I don't have a high regard for the state legislature at this point in their ability to do their job, and therefore impacting our ability to do our job. So we're fortunate this year that with Prop 22's passage, we are not probably looking at too many areas in question this year. It will probably lead more into next year. But having said that, Sacramento has a unique way when things don't work well of just upsetting the apple cart completely, regardless of where they're at in the budget. So today, our core objective is to develop and implement a balanced budget for fiscal year 2011-12, keeping our expenses within the estimated level of revenue projected to be earned by the town. In other words, if you recall, one of our strategic goals is to budget to our mission. The town's revenue is going to be comparable to that generated in 2010-11. Based on conservative estimates, we might see a slight uptick. But I do want to remind everybody, most importantly the public, that our general fund, 85% of our general fund revenue comes from TOT, sales tax, and property tax. So we have a very finite revenue base that contributes, and most of that revenue base is paid for by visitors in terms of their TOT and the sales tax in restaurants, because we do not have a distributed retail. 75% of our sales tax is directly attributable to restaurants. The town council and management team and staff remain focused on our town's established core level of services. When appropriate, we may implement modifications in service levels based on council policy and direction, while trying to live within our available revenues and maintain our general run reserve at the target level established by the town council policy of $1,025,000. So with that, Kathleen's going to turn in and talk a little bit more about some of our specific projections, and then I'll talk a little bit more after that on some of the parameter assumptions.
Thank you. Mayor, Council, before we start going through some of our numbers, I'd just also like to point out attachment 1 to the staff report, where we included our budget instructions and calendar for 2011-12. And this is the first year that that departments were given access to Springbrook to enter their budgets. And that process, it took a little bit to set up, but it's going very well. And so now they've gotten all their stuff in, and I'm reviewing it and combining it and doing my piece, and we're doing our revenue projections. And that's kind of our overall process. And you can see the calendar on the back side, which kind of outlines where we are. And we're staying on our schedule so far, and we'll be compiling all the information, and the town manager and I will be looking at where we are collectively before we sit down and meet with each department and go through their specific budget requests. And that will all be done timely before we bring it to you in May for your review and prioritization. So with that, I'm going to start with the good news, and that's on our TOT projection. We are projecting for 2011-12, we're going to project our TOT at $3,650,000. And TOT, as town manager stated, our three largest revenue sources make up 85%, and TOT is about 60% of our general fund revenue. And the $3,650,000 is really based on what we believe we will end 2010-11 with. When we project out, we're tracking ahead of our budget this year. We budgeted fairly conservatively at $3.4 million, and that was based on what we actually collected in 2009-10, which was $3.35 million. So I think with some factors that have impacted, and that's we're ticking up on the economic recovery, which means occupancy and room rates are slightly ahead of last year. And there's been marketing efforts by both the Chamber and our newly formed Yountville TID. And then also we've had new rooms come online at Hotel Yountville, and this is our first full year with Hotel Luca in business. So with all that, it's been a positive increase on our TOT. If we make the $3,650,000 for the current fiscal year, that would be a 9% increase from what we collected in 2009-10. We look at sales tax. Sales tax is challenging to project in that there's a lag when we get the information from the State Board of Equalization. They send estimated payments monthly and then do a quarterly true-up. So there's usually a 3-month lag before we know really what each quarter has earned for us. Well, sales tax represents 12% of our general fund revenue, and we're projecting $750,000. That's a preliminary number that we're plugging in right now for sales tax for 2011-12. And we think we might be slightly ahead of that for 2010-11. 750 sounds really good. It's conservative. We may be a little closer to 760, even 770, but we're just not sure because of that lag. We have to kind of see how we do these next few months in this next quarter. But 750,000 is conservative, and we will keep analyzing our revenue trends on sales tax. But it's looking pretty good for Yountville, where other communities have really taken a hit over the last 2 years and been down double digits. We've been able to maintain our sales tax with our restaurants, and our wine tasting rooms are also making an impact on that for us. Our property tax, which is one of the easier revenues to project, just based on it's pretty consistent, and we do get information from the county. It makes up 14% of our general fund revenue, and we are currently projecting $815,000 for property tax. We've earned more than that the last few years because we've been able to get the excess ERAF allocation. But since that's subject to state calculation and county approval and other things, we don't include that in our budget estimate. If we do get excess ERAF, it's always easier to come back and say, hey, we're over on our property tax. But we never count that as money that we're going to get. So our property tax, $815,000, like I said, that sounds like a pretty sound number based on what we heard from the county assessor, that our assessed value should be relatively stable next year. We'll talk a little bit about the state COPS grant, and we're going to project 0 at this time because we don't know if that's going to be funded. We have relied on that for every year to fund supplemental law enforcement services. It's $100,000 to the town's budget, so it is important to us. I'm staying on top of what's going on in Sacramento, and they say they support the program, but they don't know how to fund it, so we'll see where that goes. We'll be monitoring that very closely. I know it's near and dear to the mayor's heart as well, so we will stay on top of that. So that's kind of the overview on our major revenues. Some of our key increased expenditures I will also walk through for you. The town share of the county animal shelter. We are fortunate to have that service, but we don't really have a choice. We have to opt in if we can't provide our own service, which we're not set up to do. That contract cost is going to be $11,570, which is an increase of $2,070 from prior year. And I've been shown the spreadsheet where that's phasing in over the next few years. So every year we're going to have an increased cost associated with the animal control shelter until we're apparently paying our full share of that. The town's share of Napa County LAFCO is $8,174, and luckily that's a very modest increase from last year, so that's staying relatively flat. Our housing authority contract, which I know will be brought forth to council at a future meeting for approval, I believe in May, that's going to increase significantly by our standards. It's a 57% increase to $28,740, and that's because we've added all the new rental units with the Arroyo Grande Villas and the new Hotel Yountville units that are coming online for management and monitoring, and that's what we pay that contract to provide that service for the affordable housing. When we look at our
Sorry, if I could ask a
Yes.
quick question on that. The category of the Hotel Yountville accommodations, affordable accommodations, those are managed differently because they were built by the hotel owner? Does that still require the same management?
I should point out that the management here is the town's management and oversight of the programs, because the one program is administered on site by Napa Valley Community Housing, and we still have the responsibility to review the paperwork, document the affordability, and monitor the deed restriction. Same thing applies at Hotel Yountville, even though they're going to be, their management company will be operating and managing the facility.
So, but this relates specifically to the Napa Valley, well, it's just Napa Housing Authority contract.
Correct, because we contract with the City of Napa for all of our housing authority programs, which include our affordable home purchase, our housing, some of our housing element compliance. So what it is we brought 50 more units that they have to manage and track and document all of the income verification, et cetera. So it's a substantial leap in our monitoring and enforcement.
So it's internal with them in terms of recognizing the difference in the requirements of the Arroyo Grande resident versus the Hotel Yountville resident.
No, we have to do the same amount of work on both of those.
They still qualify the tenants by income.
Yeah, and
they still do an annual inspection.
That's why I'm just asking for the clarification, is they are still doing those even though they're two separate calculations.
That's correct, and we actually have others, because when you remember, we've had a list of all of our affordable housing. There's some other rental properties on Mount, I believe. So, and we have to periodically, and this is where, even though we've had some situations, monitor with some people not following deed restrictions. For example, we've got the current activity going on with a affordable deed restricted marketing support. So this is, extension of staff, because we do not have people trained in this particular level of background, and that's certainly something we can look at. But
And the fact that we've lost a couple of units over the last few years, single-family homes that have lost their income restriction, that's not a significant impact on the contract.
well, about
Couple houses.
You're talking about basically $500 to $600 a unit is what the monitoring cost is. So negligible, but we'll make sure we get the spreadsheet correct to make sure that if there is one that's officially lost, that we do that. But really what it is we were able to work with them last year and not have all of this apply. So they've worked very well with us and did all of the work with Arroyo Grande really on the baseline budget. And this will reflect, 50 units is a big change in our monitoring and compliance from our total portfolio.
Sure. All right. Thank you for the clarification.
Okay, so looking ahead at the public safety costs, I'd just like to point out that public safety in total, both fire and emergency medical services and law enforcement services, comprise 25% of our general fund budget expenses. The contract for the fire and emergency services, we're in our second year of a 2-year agreement, and the cost is relatively flat. So we're at $523,700, which is net of property tax assessments. And there's a component also for engine replacement that's part of the contract. The contract for law enforcement services, that's been negotiated or is being negotiated by the town manager and the sheriffs, and my understanding is that will be brought forth for council approval April 19th, I believe, and that is currently slated for a 3% increase and will be $810,830. Oh, that's the base this year. 3% increase will get it to $835,160, or a $24,000 increase to the town. Then we look at employee costs, and we have increases to our PERS retirement rates. And you can see a little schedule in the report where we show what the rates currently are, and we have Tier 1 and Tier 2, and that's basically all current employees fall in Tier 1, and when we do hire new employees, they will come in at the Tier 2 rate. So we do have an increase of just over 2%, and that cost calculates out at about $53,000 increase. Talk about it a little bit later, but I'll just mention it now as well, that we have over the last 2 years put aside some funds in a PERS reserve that we could use to help offset this cost increase in 11-12. And that would offset it by $32,000, which would help our overall budget.
Kathleen,
Vice Mayor, go ahead.
can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Didn't CalPERS just put out a new rate of return? Didn't they knock that down to 7.5? Or is that
They
not for
did not.
this?
They considered it, but they did not adopt.
Oh, they foolishly said no.
They're still at 7.75,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you.
And then we also have a CPI increase, a negotiated COLA for employees. And for the past 2 fiscal years, employees agreed to forego any salary increases. And so for 2009-10 and 2010-11, there was no COLA given. And effective July 1st, 2011, employees are contractually entitled to a COLA, which is tied to the Bay Area CPI. And it's going to be based on the one that's released in May, but we've been watching the trend, and the contract allows for between 2 to 3%. And we've been watching the trend, and we're projecting 2.5% for our budget projections. That seems like a pretty safe estimate at this point. And that, along with some step increases for employees which are eligible for step increases, nets an increased cost to salaries of $86,000.
All right, now we're going to talk about some of the parameters and assumptions, and these are where we really want to make sure we're on track. Your feedback helps us. We've been, I think, somewhat successful at bringing you a fairly good draft budget because we spent time up front with you getting some understandings about service levels and expectations. Again, our first assumption is that we're going to attempt to maintain our existing core areas of services at the same level of service where possible. So again, our first exercise is we bring in everything. What do we project it is going to cost us to do the same level of service with our revenue stream, and then we will whittle down from there to see where we're at. But that's basically where we're starting. That leads in to the next bullet point, which is we're going to discuss service level and identify and evaluate town-delivered services, talk about whether mandated, core service, level of service, cost recovery, it ties into some of those things. And that I also want to stress right now is a planning tool for us and a prioritization exercise. It's not necessarily something that I don't want to set a stage of concern that's unfounded, but I also do want to let people know that, a perception that the town is flush with money and has extra money is just not true. We have been fiscally stable, and I think we've budgeted well within that, but Kathleen mentioned the public safety being approximately 25% of our budget cost, general fund, and one which we don't have direct control of other than having the contract or not, and the option of providing the service ourselves is probably in all cases much more expensive than our current model. But I do want to share with the council just one little anecdotal footnote. Our public safety costs have risen substantially over 5 years because of an initial contract agreement with both police and fire that was backloaded. And what backloading does is it meant 5 or 6 years ago we had an easier number, which meant we had more capacity with our revenue stream. and especially in the case of our law enforcement contract, we've seen a 60% increase in our base from that 5 years ago number, 12% increases. So now we're getting to what is the fairly close to the base cost of the service. So I don't anticipate, as you see from our negotiations, a big increase, but what you've also seen is a couple $100,000 cushion that the council had with its annual budget has been eaten up by existing services. Just not, we weren't paying the full price, almost like we weren't cost recovering the full price on water and service. So I share that with people just so they realize that this is not a case of, well, where'd the money go? What are you doing with it? It was a little bit structured with how the arrangements were put together, and there hasn't been this big rampant spending spree on the part of the council to go do things that drew down that. It's just that the baseline cost. Another parameter is that we will have no services, initiatives, or programs introduced unless accompanied with an identified funding source. We're going to improve cost recovery targets. I know you keep hearing that from me, and everybody knows that, and that's what we have to do. And I will be the first to say there are still going to be free programs that will be part of what our funding structure provides. But in some areas, we need to look at whether it's appropriate, if it's a discrete user that's benefiting from the service, does that service delivery deserve a subsidy if it's being subsidized by general fund, or should that be fully cost recovered? So we'll have some more strategic discussions on those. Balance the budget with expenditures within available revenue. Unfortunately, the areas that we have complete control over are really only about 60% of our budget when you get into some of the contracted service costs. I can't call up the sheriff and say, don't change the tires on the car this week. Things like that, and I'm being simplistic, but the thing is we have a lot more control with our internal programs and manage in terms of where we expend something or what's not, and I just want to share that with you so you realize that, I don't have that latitude in discussions with about 40% of the budget. We want to continue an inclusion of our annual budget contingency, and this is not the general fund one. This is that $100,000 just in case there's something that comes up or what do we need to do. We are also, in our budget preparation, will be moving consistent with the council's adopted OPEB policy from 6% to 7%. That has an increased labor cost. So we just want to make sure we're touching in with you. Our 1% PERS reserve internal payroll. We started that in 2009, partially in preparation for what I felt was going to be increasing PERS rates. I am recommending that at this point, since that will absorb the rate increase will absorb that, I am recommending that we not continue that now because we have been able to achieve a 5-year projection from PERS and we can build that in accurately. Whether the council, I think, Kathleen and I both feel that it may be appropriate to use some of the reserve balance this year because it will be a slightly higher programmable, but we'll also bring you back a little more information on that when we get to the exact revenue projections. But as we put there, we have approximately approximately 32,000 in that available to offset PERS increased costs. We're continuing with the implementation of our second-tier PERS retirement program and medical premium cost shares for all new hires. We already mentioned the elimination of the community grants program for this fiscal year. We will decrease or defer, where possible, capital improvement projects. We're doing qualitative analysis. We're still going to do the things that we have a revenue stream to do. The water and sewer rate increases allow. We have some restricted funding sources, highway, gas tax, things like that. So there will still be a range of capital projects, but we're going to be more focused on the available revenue.
Steve, can I ask you a question? Where does undergrounding of utilities fall in that category?
Well, when you say category, are you talking about funding, high priority, low priority, available revenue stream, earmarked revenue?
I think the CIP, the Capital Improvement Program.
Well, the capital, it's in there, and it shows an unfunded balance of about $10 million. And we've
So-
pretty much exhausted, with our last three projects, we've exhausted we're down to in the plus or minus 100 range. So we don't have a dedicated funding source to apply to a significant increased utility undergrounding at this point in time. Doesn't mean that it doesn't stay in the CIP. It stays as a potential project. It just does not come with a funding source. That is not somebody, and that's also frankly not a grant eligible funding. Our aesthetics are not something that, out there. We have about $100,000 in PG&A Rule 20A money that we're working to try to better understand how we can apply that. And again, we can discuss in more detail. We had a workshop a while back, probably 2 or 3 years ago now, on potential structuring for utility undergrounding. There are tools like property owner assessment district, partial partnership with the town. So, I mean, if a neighborhood really wanted to do something, there are some ways. But, I think if you're talking about the town just paying the whole kit and caboodle, right now we don't have a lot of money to continue with utility undergrounding. We'll have to work on building that funding structure back.
Thank you.
Continued implementation of the 5-year water and wastewater rate structures that the council has implemented. I footnote that we're projecting, although we do not have confirmation from the Veterans Home, and we have requested, but we are projecting our increase at 7.5% an acre foot from $750, which will translate to a cost of $806. If that comes in less, that's a positive factor. If it comes in higher, I'd rather see that a couple years out. But that's for the best that we can do right now when we don't have any new information from the Veterans Home. We talked a little bit about Prop 22 and the impacts that we'll continue to manage and watch. We will see a potential shorting of some of the highway gas tax users. One big impact that we have to look at is the town provides a fare box subsidy for the Yountville trolley, and the Yountville trolley is also our dedicated paratransit. It's a intermodal movement that's eligible for some federal tax subsidy from the funding, from transportation funding. So if that went away, we don't have the general fund capacity to make up the core federal transportation subsidy. That's the first thing I'm saying, let alone dealing with the fare box, because we're dealing with approximately 10% of the fare box recovery. So we are projecting somewhere in the neighborhood of about $30,000, but the total cost of the bus operations is about $270, and we don't obviously have from what we just discussed. So I'm just saying that's, if something were to happen at the federal level and they eliminate that, the trolley would probably, be on its way out of town. And I will also say, at this current projections and talking with NCTPA staff, there is no indication right now that there's going to be any significant changes in that particular transportation structure. But while I don't think Washington, D.C. would be considered stable, I do think that particular funding structure right now is probably a little bit more secure than some of the discussions we're hearing in Sacramento. But again, that's just a footnote that if something were to happen, we don't have the funding to backfill that operation.
But on the good side, not to leave with total negativity about the trolley, the NCTPA did recently approve new trolley vehicles, assuming that federal money remains available.
And I do think that this particular program is fairly secure. But again, things change, and then we'll have to reevaluate those. But that's our operating parameter, is that we will continue to fund the fare box.
I would just add, under the gas tax, the monies that the town gets in its gas tax fund that we utilize for streets maintenance and projects. The state has already, over this past year, played some games with that and deferred some of our payments, and it hasn't prevented us from doing projects we want to do, but I think there's a risk that that type of activity at the state could continue.
Some of the CIP projects that we're anticipating for inclusion in this year's budget include a limited water main replacement, tree management program, pathway and sidewalk management. We're going to be identifying and prioritizing some of the Hopper Creek flood and stream mitigations. I will also point out that that is a Measure A funded source, so that does not impact the general fund. Limited street paving slurry seal program. Again, those are gas and restricted funds, some of which can only be used for those purposes, as well as the town. One of the reasons we have better roads than the average Napa community is we have put general fund revenue periodically into street projects. Our recycled water project, which is our mandate from the Regional Water Quality Control Board, that will begin in earnest in terms of the planning and design. Council chambers, AV equipment, we've done some evaluation and we're running on approximately, I want to say, almost 20-year-old camera technology and some stuff that's basically we've been told it's almost impossible to get parts in if something were to happen. So we're going to look at some things to do that. The good news is you do have a potential help there. The PEG 1% on the cable bill is restricted to cable TV access and stuff, so that type of thing. While that fund balance is not necessarily generated sufficient to pay for the whole project, it is, again, a dedicated or restricted funding source earmarked specifically for that type of expenditure. So a small positive silver lining there. And then we really would like to look at electronics record management, depending on how far our budget will go. Targets that likely will remain deferred include general plan update, final design and planning for the seismic retrofit of this facility, resurfacing the tennis courts, additional water line replacement projects, although I will point out once we get the full implication of the rates in place, we will be able to reprogram appropriately both the water and sewer line projects into our 5-year planning queue. And Marita, the question there, your additional utility undergrounding, solar feasibility study, and shuttle expansion, Yountville shuttle trolley service from 5-day service to 7-day is not likely to occur under this current structure.
Vice Mayor, a question?
Is it, I know that's a CIP list, although I guess the shuttle service expansion is not necessarily. Is there assumption on your part that there's not any inclusion of additional funds for additional library hours?
Actually, I haven't put that in as part of our budget. We have, at this point, the budget as it's initially projected to include, will include potential funding for 2 hours at approximately $22,000.
Okay.
Now, again, that's a placeholder at this point, consistent with our past expenditure level adjusted to reflect that. But that is going to be in the tentative budget, again, subject to review by the council. For review and discussion purposes only, we've attached a worksheet of approximately 60 programs and activities and initiatives that are somewhat discrete that can be looked at in terms of service delivery components, cost recovery, level of service change. And I've got a few questions. I mean, one is for the council to consider, what are the core service levels available that our revenue can support? And I also want to point out, this is more for discussion and policy, because when you give us some parameters and feedback, we can go back and evaluate. We are not prepared here, nor are we anticipating part of the dialogue to go tell you that service level A at park maintenance would result in this cost, and service level B is this cost, and what that. This is more of a high-level initial thought process for you. What service reductions would the council consider appropriate? What are the sacred cows, programs or funding? That's helpful for staff to know where you don't want to go as well. Should we review our permits, fees, and charges to ensure that those costs are fully recovered? What are the appropriate cost recovery targets for our community of Parks and Rec service programs? What capital improvement projects might we have to defer to future years? What planned projects is the council willing to eliminate or defer, such as the general plan update, subsidy, employee training, funding for 4th of July fireworks, Festival of Lights, lighting, after-school summer camp program. So it's more a discussion point, not necessarily saying that any of these things are not doable within the budget, but again, some of these, as you can see, we start having a level of prioritization if we're going to achieve all of the council's goals, because if one of your goals is we want to do all these programs, we want to stay within available revenue, and you aren't going to touch the general fund reserve, I'm here to tell you that potentially that doesn't all line up. I'm also going to tell you we're not here telling you that we're 400,000 or 500,000 at all in the hole, because I don't want to cast that. We're here to say this is some stuff that the council may need to discuss, and we may need to sharpen our pencil and look at as we bring forward. I am kind of pleased. We did a little brainstorming workshop as a management team and put together a little chart here, and it was a down and kind of a down and dirty, but we identified, like I say, 60 program services. And what I thought might be helpful is some discussion of, is it mandated? Is it essential? Is it a discretionary service? Can we change the level of service? And can we change the fee or cost recovery? So with your indulgence, we'll kind of roll through a few of these and get some feeling from the council. And this, again, is at a high level. We're kind of looking for a consensus from the council on what are some of your thoughts, and also for review. And again, this is to help us have an understanding for where, especially in the areas, if we needed to reduce the cost, is that an area that the council would be willing to consider a service level or a fee? So,
Steve, if I can just make a comment to that before we try to get into that. It's going to be challenging for us to identify priorities without knowing the fiscal impacts of those priorities.
I think I'm going to say a yes and a no. I understand that, and I'm not putting a zero-sum dollar in front of you because I agree with that. What we're trying to get a feel from you is which areas, again, we have a lean staff, and part of what I'm concerned about is, to go give you the full cost analysis and break down everything like this, I don't have the staffing component to do that. I'll be very honest with you. We are not set up. But what I am interested in doing, if there's some areas that the council believes we want to spend a little more work on, then I think we can do that. And I understand the challenge there of trying to do that. And I say, like right now, this is more of a tool for us to get a sense of where the council might like more information, much like you saw what Samantha brought back with you on some of those areas. And like I said, I do not have right now a parks maintenance level A at $412,000, and it'll look like this. Parks level B, 360. But those are some areas, and more, this is to help us tool up, because there are some areas that we're doing some homework on, and we realize we're not doing as well on cost recovery. But we also know in the past, cost recovery has not been a priority of the council. So
one thing that I would say would be helpful before we were to get into this chart or any other broader discussion, it'd be to identify your first three columns, which is what do we even have discretion over, and at what level is that discretion? I mean, we could have a conversation about any number of these items, but then you tell us that they're mandated by the state or federal government, or required by a permit process, and that changes the whole dynamic.
It does, but I also will share with you, a number of the mandated services does not necessarily mean that we have to continue providing them at our current level, and that's part of this discussion. there's ranges, and I realize this is, and I'm not meant to do this. This was more to get the juices started, because in some of our strategic planning discussions, what came out was, have we ever looked at why we're doing what we're doing? And this is a cursory first start at that. But for example, a lot of our planning stuff is actually mandated. The town has to do a certain level of planning and support services, but at what level? And again, some of planning can be offset by our charges for permits and fees, but maintaining the general plan, having a housing element, and some of those things, we are required. That's one of the requirements as an incorporated community.
Steve, just a quick question. Back to this, because it's it's an interesting, list of all the things that are obviously, high sort of visibility items, if you will. I kind of went through it myself, and one of the things that struck me is that just because something is mandated or essential or discretionary doesn't mean that you couldn't go out and find potentially an alternative income source, a revenue source for that. Is that your interpretation as well?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And I guess my next question on this is, so out of this work that you guys have done, there's a lot of work that goes into a budget. It's an exercise, I get, that we ultimately all are held to. Is there an expectation that what you guys are going to come away with tonight is, okay, this is, by May X, May date, we're going to come up with a plan based on what we discuss and give direction on. Is that the expectation tonight? Is that your understanding?
Well, I think two things I'm looking at is we're looking for some confirmation that the parameters and the key projections that we've identified make sense, resonate with you, and that's a takeaway for us that we're going to use in building the budget.
Okay.
Again, our first goal is to try to deliver our core service, maintain our current status quo within our revenue stream. And Kathleen and I haven't finished that to tell you if that's been achieved or not. Obviously, if it's achieved, then some of this discussion becomes less challenging for the council, because you're not faced in what some of our neighboring communities are doing, where they're actually having to cut budgets and eliminate, and then they're going in, and part of what their question is, what do we prioritize in order to know what we're keeping or what level? So part of this, but I think, your earlier comment, you're correct. We do have opportunities, even if it's a mandated service, to look at cost recovery. For example, we don't do a whole lot on police and fire cost recoveries, even though we could set some of the fees and elements, bails, parking fines, but we haven't been very proactive in that area because it's administered by another entity. So I'm not suggesting that's an easy one to go out and get right away, but in many cases, staff hears me talk about 2,000, 5,000, and 10,000 make a big difference in our scale of what we can do. An illustration that I'm very pleased with is our new FOG program fee that you adopted not too long ago. We've been absorbing that administratively in the Public Works wastewater treatment admin budget. The distributed cost is the new fee structure generates $7,000 to offset the administrator. We have 26 to 28 establishments, including the town, that will have to pay one of our monitoring fees, but we've been out doing that service. So again, that's a point where you're right. We can change the method of delivery a little bit, perhaps, to reduce cost, if that's acceptable, or look at cost recovery. And cost recovery doesn't always mean fees. There could be other things involved in how we do that. So I think part of our exercise today was, one, just to introduce that theme. I mean, that we make, when we see where we're at, we may want to sit down with you and say, are there some things that are more comfortable for the council to work on? For example, we know we have general fund subsidies still in a number of our parks and community services activities. After-school program, daycare, it is not paying for itself. What level, is that something that we want a 100% cost recovery, or what targets? So those are some, additional, and I'm not asking us to do that today. This was really introduce these themes and then come back. And then part of it is, if it's not essential but it's mandated and we have to do it, do we have to continue to do it at the level we've been doing it? Maybe you'll tell us, that's an okay thing to do at the B level.
So let's move into this. What exactly, to maybe ask your question again, what are you asking from us tonight? Are we going to go through 60 items one by one and categorize them by 5 different columns?
Well, I think the question, I think you have an option to do it that way. Or, one of the things we're also interested in is seeing what the council identifies as discretionary or essential. So the only way I know to have that exercise is for you all to do that, or for you to send something to me and then I present a summary that I can send back to you, which might not be a bad process right now.
Matter of fact, that's exactly what I was going to propose.
But, because what it's important for us is to know where we're going to, potentially take this dialogue if it's necessary.
So what I would propose, we look at not so much the chart right now. I think that's going to be a useful tool as we move forward. And I would suggest that we individually make notations of our priorities and give those to you for additional budget consideration. But I would also be interested to hear the council and ask that we provide you feedback on your questions that are at the end of your report, which has to do with a little bit broader scope. If there are specific areas of interest, or a council member feels like something is truly off limits in terms of cutting or mandatory in our service level, I would be interested that we provide that to you right now. The rest of the detail, I think, would be appropriate for further down the road.
I think that would be a very good start, and also if there are any parameters or projection discussion issues, concerns that you have, if you could raise those, that would also be helpful.
Great. So, Councilmember Moeller, do you have a question at this point? And then let's get some questions, and then we will start providing some specific feedback. So, Councilmember Moeller, question?
So I have a global question as it relates to the county. What I've been seeing over the last few years is that most likely because the county is facing the same type of budget issues as we are, they've been identifying things that, now Yountville needs to pay this. Now Yountville needs to pay their fair share of this. And, there are bigger items coming up, like there's some initial conversations going on. I've heard at least comments about, AB 32. We'll have to maybe do that as a group and send Yountville a bill, if you will. So what kind of discussions are we having, or you having with the county about some of those charges that we're getting, that we get the bill, but like with the library and other things, we don't really get much input into the quality of the service or how efficiently are they running the service. Can you speak to that?
In short, not very well. I think there are a number of services, some of the regional ones, where you talk about some of the sustainability things out of NCTPA. We do have a better opportunity to weigh in and participate. Frankly, I do believe we've now sat down with the county and identified most of the key areas that they're going after for cost recovery, and the animal shelter is a classic example. The reason that we're seeing a cost increase is they've discounted it because they've never
Picked up a dog in Yountville.
So now we're looking at a 5-year phasing before we'll get to our core cost. So the county, we don't operate what would be considered joint powers authorities. The county basically sends us a bill. They have a planning meeting where they invite us to have some input, and they basically tell us what it's going to be. Now, that depends a little bit, but same way, I don't have any impact on LAFCO. We get a bill from LAFCO. This particular year, we do have a council member sitting on LAFCO, but I mean, some of those we don't have a lot of latitude with the county. We do have some discussions with police and fire, but, we are not at the table. We do not influence labor negotiations. We do not influence a variety of other factors, their admin overhead, their cost allocation. They do a lot of the same things that we do in our budgeting on a different level. I mean, their technology, IT support, labor cost. We've been much more progressive on implementing some modifications to our employee benefits than the county has, although I am pleased to report that they're making progress on that, and they will be doing some things. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but...
No, I mean, you are. I have a follow-up question just related to that. I mean, is there more that we can do? Because I don't want to get to the, down many years down the road where we have very little discretionary budget left because we have to pay these bills that we don't really have much control or input into.
The challenge is negotiating future. When you look at some of the shared services, consolidation, it all becomes in how governance is structured. When you're buying X from Y, you have less impact. Because if it costs X $12, they aren't really going to give you, unless they have a reason to, they're not going to discount it. And I think in this current model, you've seen, most entities are much more careful, as they should be, at looking at cost recovery and knowing what their costs for deliver a service are.
Well, I think this is in a real state of flux right now anyway because of the state budget, or the lack of a state budget. They're already proposing prison early release that's going to impact local services. We may get a bill from the county on something like that, or mental health services. Those types of things, while there may be a percentage of impact on Yountville, we will be participating in the cost recovery that is no longer coming from the state. So
there's
it'll go beyond the animal shelter.
Well, but I think there are, the county has consistently tried to convince us to pay for part of the homeless shelter and a few other things. And some of those we've said, that's not in our service delivery mode. That's a county service delivery mode. I don't think the county will stop trying to do some of those things. But I do think, their nexus has to be fairly strong for us to sit down. For example, on the animal shelter, Calistoga chose to withdraw from the agreement. But they've contracted with a local veterinarian and put out a professional services agreement and have a place, a structure in place to actually deal with that. We don't have a vet in Yountville, and so we're struggling on a few of those types of things. But I do think you will see us continue to have dialogue, and it's not only the county. I've had conversations Bob and I did with our. We're a hybrid service delivery. We contract, for example, street sweeping is with a private vendor. On this portfolio of cost containment and cost control, it's not just the public agencies, but it's our vendor service delivery. Is there a way to do that? But we are starting to see that some of the, as the economy starts to return a little bit, we're also seeing fuel costs and a few other things, and we're starting to see some costs go up rather than stay flat. Some segments still hungry. Some segments aren't.
Let's move forward on this. I know Councilmember Dornbecker mentioned you have a question also.
Well, yes, I do, and I will preface it by saying this is the first time I've been involved in the budget process, but I find it very difficult to answer a question of whether the Zoning and Design Review Board is mandate essential. How much does that cost us? I really don't have the answer to that, so how can I even say? And that's not the only one. I mean, SB 375 and AB 32, do we have a choice? Don't we have to do those things? I mean, I don't know what you're asking me for. I can't answer some of these questions. I just cannot.
Well, and that's why I'm proposing, and it sounds like the council may be in agreement, that we use this as a tool as we move forward, and if any of us have individual questions about how to provide our prioritization, we can handle that on a one-on-one basis with the town manager. But I would like to get us to some general, broader priorities, if we can identify some of those during this conversation. So, are there other specific questions about moving forward, or can we start moving forward with those thoughts?
No questions from me.
Is that good for staff?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Sure. We can offer public comment before we do that. Since this is really informational or providing feedback for the staff, we would love it if any of our public that's here tonight would like to provide feedback on that process. There will certainly be many opportunities in the next couple of months to discuss the budget and discuss our prioritization of the budget items. No motion from the audience, so thank you. Thank you for the reminder. We're always interested in hearing any feedback that's provided. So let's start. Councilmember Dornbecker, if I could ask you to just begin reviewing the italicized questions on page 6 of the staff report. Generally speaking, if you want to call out any of these questions with specific priorities that you might have that will help the staff prioritize our interests when they're putting the general budget document together.
Okie dokie.
Well, let me do this so I don't put the pressure on you specifically to answer them all. I'm going to ask these questions. If anybody has a specific comment to make with the question, please let me know and we'll get that addressed. If nobody has a specific area of interest, we'll just move right through the questions. So let's just ask or offer up core service levels. What are the core service levels that available revenue can support? Generally speaking, are there any core service levels that anybody would like to highlight as critical, essential, that we fund to a maximum level? And I'll just open this, if it stays under control, to a little bit of a free dialogue so that we can work through this. And don't feel like you need to say, yes, I agree, and then say why. If your item has been brought up, it's been brought up. So,
Well, I'll start then. Obviously, I believe that the current service levels that we have for public safety and the water enterprise funds, as we've discussed them, and the wastewater enterprise fund should be things that we continue at the current levels. Public safety is critical, and I don't think anyone in this room would disagree with that, but I could be wrong.
Councilman Rowley, were you ready with that?
My answer?
Any other core services, Vice Mayor?
Well, I'll say I agree. I think that there's the list here when it comes to sort of this, looking at what's most important. I mean, we several years ago added more staffing to town maintenance in terms of the parks. I think we have done a fabulous job, and I want to continue that. Do I think we have to do it to the level we're doing it now? No, I don't. So I think that's probably certainly lower to me than police and fire and water and sewer. And the same thing goes with the community service programming. We have, in my opinion, no choice but to look at some of these and say, what is it that we can fund? Or are there, the Calistoga example is a good one, are there alternative structures? Can we go out to the private market? And we may not know the answer. Maybe we put an RFP out and say, can you run X program for us and what would it cost? And somebody might do it. So I think that to me is the really high level hierarchy. I also would say when Steve talked about, can I talk about the service reduction? I'll do that.
No.
Because I can go from there to there.
Well, let's try to stay on point with these.
So that's all. That's what I have to say from an operating budget perspective.
Any
Well,
additional feedback?
no, I certainly agree that, fire and safety and water and wastewater is, those are mandatory. We must do those. I guess we can talk about the level of maintenance at the town parks and facilities, and I don't know, I think planning and building inspection services are important because they could be sort of not a revenue generator, but there could be some offset there.
100%.
What I would suggest in this category, there's going to be, I think, pretty solid agreement on public safety and our water and wastewater programs as being essential and core, that we make sure that we understand what is a core service and what is a discretionary preferred service. And, we need to know what those, if there are substantial important yet discretionary services that we're providing that some of us may think are core services that are required or mandatory, let's just make sure that we know the difference, so that if we're looking at a reduction of non-essential, we just know what those are. Service reductions, if there, I think you just spoke to one about, and this is not, we want to cut down our park townwide beautification program. This is, we acknowledge that maintaining our parks is not as important as maintaining our public safety. So let's not misconstrue what we're doing when we're trying to prioritize, so.
Right.
So,
And that-
Vice Mayor, you said you had some.
Yeah, and I would agree with that on community service programming. You brought up, I would go back to the idea of, are there things that we could do externally cheaper? And also the idea, we talk about things that are mandated. LAFCO is a good example. We can't control that here, but in our LAFCO discussion that we had a budget meeting on, I'm on the budget committee, we talked, what I think for the first time was, the budget pressures that occur in all the jurisdictions are getting great and are getting greater every year. And there's a question between LAFCO, do we have to do everything we do now, or do we do the bare minimum that we're mandated to do? And we could certainly, LAFCO is an example, we could do less and just meet the letter of the law. And I think that's some of the questions that I would have on when it comes to AB 32 or other items of what's the bare minimum we need to do in the short term versus the longer term. And I think that discussion we can have.
And that actually is one of the things, and I'm glad you're seeing a little bit of how we're trying to have the dialogue. And I'll work with Marita. We'll spend some time to get you more comfortable with some of the budgeting process. But you're correct. I mean, part of this right now is not to drill down to all the costs because we're not set up at that funding structure. But I do think if you guys are saying, hey, we're interested in, this is a mandated program, we need to do something, but put a program together that's going to be at the meets level, not high level. Right. Those are some things that will help staff. And then, we can identify on some of these areas. Because, for example, you're correct. AB 32 and SB 375 are mandated, and we have to do a certain level of compliance and documentation and record keeping to move forward with that. Do we have to go beyond that?
I also, just another thing that I would say is you talked about the tree lighting, 4th of July fireworks. I mean, we may all love those. Those are clearly discretionary items, in my opinion. And there are funding sources out there that, if you take the tree lighting, that theoretically brings people to town. Well, there is the T-bid, there is the Chamber of Commerce, how the sharing of that occurs, how important do businesses really think that is to driving revenue, et cetera. I think those are things that have to be at least looked at and maybe discussed with those quote-unquote interest groups. So that's all I have on those.
Councilmember Moeller?
So regarding service reductions, I mean, some of the smaller ticket items, I personally really think, we should maintain the levels of the parks. There's so much visibility from the tourists who see that. And the last time I looked at the budget, we did a whole lot for like $50,000. So I'm kind of like, I don't want any fewer opportunities around. I think we're doing a great job, and it's really cost effective. However, I would be able to maybe have us consider our urban, what do we call that, urban forestation program. I mean, we've got the path open here. Let's not, get off target for our tree trimming of our heritage tree, but maybe we could do our urban forest management every odd year, every even year. I'd like some input for, if we don't do it every year, are we just going to have to spend twice as much money that next year, or is it something we just look at every other year? Maybe we can save a little there, how much that's going to be. And, back to the community center, there's no doubt that that's a big ticket item, but it's also very important to our community. So I think that's where you're going to get a lot of bang for your buck, really looking at, you might be offering this class, but, with your survey, if nobody really likes it, maybe it's time to sunset something like that. So really looking at, how much priority and revenue that people are willing to pay will give you some some sense of just how valuable those programs are. So I think we're going to be able to, and I know this is a long-term plan for the community center, but, any of the big-ticket items that you can really look at now, and, maybe you just need to study it a little bit more before you put it in. But, certainly, because I know you have several items about all the programming, so I think really taking a hard look at that in case we really need to make some cuts makes a lot of sense to me. Another minor item is you had on here like the using the we do audio visual of our commission meetings. I believe, maybe it's because our equipment's too archaic, but we should be able to get information from Channel 28, how many people are out there watching. If nobody's looking at, a ZDRB meeting, we shouldn't be televising it. We should be able to get, with a phone call, some information about how many hits we're getting. I mean, and I think that kind of information is going to help us drive whether we're going to spend the money for TV services for some of these commissions. So I would suggest something like that. So those are my initial thoughts for possible service reductions.
Okay, any other service reduction ideas
Well-
specifically?
Well, I just feel that the budget of every department really should be opened up to us to look at, and so that we can weigh whether or not there are, service reductions that the town would consider appropriate, looking at the different departments.
I do think, again, I want to go back, and I apologize if there's any digression from what our real intent was. This is meant to be kind of a higher level policy rather than drilling down, but it's to show, because the council's been asking us how are we to think. The current budget identifies, as Councilmember Dornbecker was talking about, we have it broken down into all the various programs and budgets. And what we're really talking about, just so everybody understands, one of the key budget parameters is our objective is to maintain that level of service. And this is really helpful for staff to realize that if our revenue stream doesn't deliver that, then what might we come look at doing? And some of that could be a combination of improving cost recovery targets on discrete activities like building permits if we don't think we're at where we need to be, maybe raising summer camp fees and things like that to the cost. And, we're going to talk about things that are $4,000 here, deferring a vehicle. But, like I say, some of this discussion, and we haven't drilled down because the organization here really hasn't assessed, and I think, Vice Mayor's discussion about, what's the minimum level that a mandated service has versus, for example, we have to have a housing element. And there's some things associated with the housing element that we have to do. A lot of that's staff and admin gunk, for lack of a better word, but, that's staff resources, and we have to do it. It's not something that you guys get a whole lot of bang for buck in the community, because I can guarantee you when you walk the streets, they're not going, really good job on that HCD report. But we have a lot of those things we have to do. The same thing with our CAFR. So for us, this is the beginning of trying to understand when we put something together, because to be perfectly honest, in this organization, we haven't identified some of these levels. And before I can do that, I also don't want to embark on a path without, prioritizing, if you will, on that list where you think we should spend some time. Because to go do what I would consider an outstanding cost analysis, I mean, we're locking, probably almost a full-time position doing, we don't have a legislative analyst that does the budget projections like some of the larger organizations, but we can drill down and understand what might, if there's a handful we need to work on, then we can go in and really refine those. But again, we're going to have a better feel in about a month of where our revenues. But I wanted to start this because people have asked us, what are you doing? And I think you guys have asked us to take a good look at our budget. And these are some of the questions internally we're asking ourselves.
Well, unfortunately, the council recently adopted a increase in library hours. It's probably the most inefficient use of our dollars to add 2 hours to the library, unfortunately, but it's been a priority for the council. So that's a conversation I think we have to have about what value are we getting for the dollars we're spending. And we've all said it's a high priority to get more hours for the library because it's a community impact. But is it worth, $22,000 for 2 hours? And while we've established that vote was just taken to accept that, that's something that I think we need to continue to review. If that county policy doesn't improve to the more benefit of Yountville, that's one I think is the most inefficient use of our money. So, again, not something we want to do, but I think it's something that we have to have on the table for discussion, certainly. I would move also forward to, is it safe to assume that we would all be interested in continuing to review our permit fees and charges to see if there are additional new revenue opportunities out there?
This one I feel very strongly about. I think we should move to revenue neutral as much as possible here. If we need the money for that. This is pretty much my big ticket item, that, is each taxpayer in Yountville really willing, or should they be subsidizing a lot of these fees and permits that go to a very specific use? So I think that's going to be something that I'm going to be really looking close at if we really have to be squeezing money. Is I can't really see that every taxpayer should be paying for a developer's fee, that we're paying for here. So that's I feel strongly about that one.
The last thing you just said kind of confused me. What I was about to comment on was I think staff would want to know if there is a change in our focus about prioritizing local services and local programming versus non-residential. That has been a priority for us to say we want to discount and make very affordable the services to our residents. But if we're now saying, as Steve mentioned before, we can't then say, okay, we want to maximize our cost recovery on all programming, because that's two separate messages.
I actually think with a certain parameters, if we hear from you that you're interested in cost recovery being focused, I can break some of these down into more discrete. For example, building permits, inspections, when you say we want to go towards cost neutral, that's fine. Mm-hmm. We can do that. Under the Parks and Community Services and Recreation, I think the direction and interest that we would like to know from you is our tolerance to review that. Let us come back to you with what might be a proposed cost recovery, because some programs we do not want to have a big differentiation between resident and non-resident, because we need the non-resident participation in order to make that program even go. So
and I think there is a difference, and I think that's what my comment was to your point. There, in my opinion, is a great difference between commercial costs and permits for an out-of-town business to do business in Yountville, for example, or our new film policy about charging for film and photography. That's totally different than providing a community service to our local residents. So it does, I think, need to have that differentiation in there. I believe that's what you were talking about.
That's exactly right. My comment was specifically targeting to planning and building.
I have a question, and that is, since we invested so much money into the swimming pool, and I don't use it, I don't care about it, to me, it's like nowhere. But it seems to me that would be very irresponsible of us to have put so much money into putting that together and then just, walking away from it. I don't know.
I think there's a substantial use through the community services department and our not only local residents, but
all of these.
That is one of those things we have talked about over the years that is unlikely to ever break even or make money.
Right.
And we have accepted that fact, similar to the trolley service on a very different scale, similar to some other services where if the majority of the council agrees that all services, recreational and otherwise, need to pay for themselves, that's a very different focus.
I think, to that, and again, we're putting things out there. For example, if you're looking for one thing and you wanted to save 50 or 60,000, not operating the swimming pool would give you that, because our current subsidy is about 70,000, and we're probably reaching the point where that's 60,000, maybe 50 is the best we're going to get that program to. But to Councilmember Dornbecker's perspective, we have a lot of programs, and when you're looking at this, even in private sector business models, sometimes that satellite facility you open all of a sudden doesn't pencil out. And I guess my question to you is, we're going to put a number of these things together. And again, I think the earlier comment that was made, I want to really stress, right now this is a planning and a discussion phase to help us should we get further down, and we need. And I recognize right now that you don't have a finite number in front of you to say, we haven't got to the stage in the budget development where we say we're 100,000 off on revenue. Here are some of the core program areas, what they cost, and how do you want to whittle. Part of our objective would be, we would clearly get you that kind of information as we get to that stage, so that you're able to evaluate programs and the cost. So I just want you to know that this is not a, if we get to that point, you won't be doing that in the dark and in a vacuum. You'll have many facts, but there are some that I can share with you right now, where we know in the Parks and Rec, for example, the after-school program, we have a discrete number of users. Benefit, is there a community-wide benefit versus a general benefit? Is there a societal benefit? All those questions that can go into the program.
So I'm going to ask that we redirect the conversation at this point. I feel like we're kind of randomly trying to target things without really understanding the impact. So I would like to shift the conversation back to the other part of the report, and I know the Vice Mayor has comments about the budget adjustments and projections we have here. I think if we can talk to these items now and then continue the budget conversation as we get harder numbers to associate with these philosophical
before I move on
positions.
that, I guess what I'm hearing, not a whole lot of sacred cows. I am hearing from the
Fireworks.
council. Pardon?
Fireworks.
Oh, there's good. See, that's at least one.
A sacred cow? Okay.
The reason I'm asking is, I'm hearing from the council a willingness to look at cost recovery when better identified. Is that a fair statement?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. And that's important for us, because that's a change from several years. So, we know what that means to go do you may see some recommendations in a broader range of areas as the budget's developed.
And we do still want to go back to the bottom of page 5, where we list the CIP projects that the town manager went through and potential projects that are likely to be deferred, and just make sure that's in keeping with the council's priority.
So you would like to hear from us if we feel like anything on the anticipated for 2011-12 we feel like should be deferred, or any deferred items we feel should be put back on the higher priority list? So let's tackle that next. Vice Mayor, did you have a comment specific to the anticipated CIP or deferred CIP list?
I think it looks good.
Does anyone have any items they would like to add to either list or subtract from either list? Councilmember Moeller?
Tree management, I would say if the money's going to our heritage oak, I'm fine with it, and something else I would defer one other year on that one. And I'd just like to make a general comment about the CIP. We've always been able, when we had building going on, be able to fund, with extra general fund, our CIP. I'd like to, maybe down the line after the budget gets done, start really talking about a better mechanism. We're basically draining those funds, and we've got, the CIP list is growing. We really are going to have to tackle how we're going to get money into our CIP, because it's pretty well depleted and the projects aren't going away. So,
Councilmember Hall, you've been somewhat silent.
Being the budget person that I am, I know better than to wade into these topics as early as they are being presented. I have no changes on the anticipated items or the deferral at this point in time.
I would just add that, again, this really depends on what savings we would be talking about, both in dollars and in staff hours. But on the anticipated budget item, the Chamber's audiovisual equipment replacement, as frustrating as it can be, certainly not a core service. We don't want to negatively impact our ability to get the message out to the public, however. Electronic records management system, again, I don't know how taxing that is financially and staff time to do it or not do it immediately. Those would be two items that I would say are potentials to postpone. But I also agree with all the list on the deferrals. I don't agree quite as strongly about deferring the tree management program, just worried that, like with the water main replacement, having just seen a water main rupture in town, that if we don't stay ahead of the management program, we may be looking at a higher cost down the road of damage control from trees. But again, it's going to be that sliding scale of how much cost and staff time will need to go into that kind of a program. So, any other comments on the CIP list themselves? Councilwoman Dornbecker, please.
I agree with you that the Chamber's audiovisual equipment replacement could be deferred, as well as the electronic records management. I believe that the tree management program could be in alternating years. I think that's a great idea. And I don't understand what limited street paving and slurry seal is, but the funds that come out of the general fund, perhaps we could limit that. So that would be on the deferred. I would like to find out if there are other sources of, other ways that we could find money for the solar feasibility study, because I think that that is something that is planning for the future, and that would someday save us money. There you are.
Thank you. So now let's, Kathleen, is that enough sufficient?
That's very helpful, thank you.
Then I'd like to get any comments, and I'll start with the Vice Mayor, on specific comments as they relate to the first portion of the report, being the projections and budget impacts.
My first comment on page 1 has to do with the general fund reserve. It was my thought that when we added money at the end of the allocation period, that would actually stay at that higher level. I think we added $100,000 or $75,000 to the general fund reserve this past year when we had $400,000 to allocate.
We added $80,000 to it. Our policy currently is that we maintain $1,025,000. It's not that the 80's not there.
Right.
But I thought at the time the council made that decision, it was to, keeping in mind that we might have $100,000 taken away from COPS grant.
Right.
We might need to come back and revisit that 80 in play to help balance the budget. But that's obviously your all decision to make.
Okay, that was just a comment I had. I think your revenue projections are very conservative, and which is exactly what we should be, and I'm very, very comfortable with all of those numbers. I did think it was interesting, the 25% of total for public safety. I think we're actually very low compared to a lot of cities on that, so in many ways, we're very fortunate to be in that situation. The PERS retirement program, I know they gave us numbers, but I think that 775 is going to change someday soon. The only major item that I'm truly concerned about is the existing policy on our OPEB rate, which is on page 4 of 7. I very strongly believe, and I said it when prior councils put in the current policy, I disagree with it, that we need to implement a policy that within a very short amount of time gets us to our full reserve. We should be reserving 15%. That's what the actuarial says. Every year we do it less. Sorry, Steve, in your words, we're not paying full price. So I think right now the one thing that we are doing that is deferring costs from today to the future is we're not reserving our OPEB rate enough, and I think that cost needs to be presented, and we need to know what that impact is. And I think we talked about that, if you remember back when the actuary was here, we had that,
Yes.
I always said I wanted to see that chart that had years 11 through 30.
Right.
If we could include that in one of our discussions, I would
Right.
appreciate that.
When we will be bringing that forth as part of our budget discussion, what our policy going forward.
And I
needs to
understand
be
that's a
with
significant
regard to
amount
that.
of money, but I
It-
think we need
it
to look
is.
at it.
So to the Vice Mayor's first question, do you need specific clarification from council about whether, or is it just a matter of going back to the specific language of the additional 80,000 being a new minimum balance, or just adding 80,000 to that minimum?
Well, the resolution added it, and if you want that to be your minimum, we can do that administratively. We'll bring that back when we clean that up, if that was the intent.
So, but right now, the minimum is, as stated, $1,025,000, and we've just added to that fund.
You actually have, you
That
are,
actually is my recollection of the intent.
you have more than your
Yes.
minimum balance.
It was just to
Yes.
add more to that reserve.
Yes, yes. So
Does any other-
make no mistake, the money is there.
Right.
Right.
Any other council comment to that item specifically? No? Vice Mayor, did you? No. No? So are there any other comments to any of the other budget projections or adjustments that we're looking at
I have
at this point?
another.
Councilmember Moeller?
The $100,000, I'll just call it a slush fund for, better choice of words.
Contingency reserve.
Thank you. How much of that has been spent to date?
We've only spent 50,000 this year, and that was, as you know, we allocated that to
Playground.
cover some of the costs associated with maintaining pound management on,
Oh, yes,
as
okay.
we've had some issues related to the litigation and support for that. So we still, if I'm not mistaken, do have 50,000 that hasn't
correct.
been utilized, and at this point, knock on wood, we won't need to use.
Okay. So you're right now recommending to put that in, and I'm fine with that, but if we get close, I mean, that's going to be one of the first things that I
Absolutely.
scoop
That will be a
into
policy
something else,
decision.
And
probably.
again, I really, if anybody, I realize, and we do have some folks that are new to the budget, so I think for us, we realize these are continuing parameters, and seeing the end product, we've got to help you with. So we'll spend some time with both of you getting, but you're right, as we get a little bit closer and we know where we're at, then this conversation becomes, in some cases, easier, even though the decisions may be challenging, but knowing what it is, like if we're dealing with 50,000, then you're right, we may choose to put a 50,000 contingency
Right.
in rather than a 100,000.
And the other thing I want to add to that is, as we're putting in our budget projections, we're also sharpening our pencils on where we're going to end this current fiscal year. And we think we'll have some savings, and our revenue projections look good, so it's all going to come into play. We'll be bringing
And-
that forth as we have more information.
And there may be some ways to address the council's interest in, funding OPEB, and this is a balancing act, and I think the vice mayor has identified it real well. If I put 15% in, then I can guarantee you our personnel costs are going out, and we're going to have to cut something else, and that's that balancing act. And I also want to point out that our current policy has a net positive. What I mean by that is we're meeting our pay-as-our-go minimum, and we're putting money in right now. So we are not reaching into the OPEB reserve that we're about to move into the irrevocable trust. So we are still adding to the positive balance, and it may very well be that when we have a year end and we close on a favorable basis, that we bring back those revenue, and you allocate whether that's the highest priority or putting some, distributing some into OPEB and some into capital projects fund. Because Councilmember Moeller's concern, I share very much so, which is, impact fees are negligible going forward, and our capital project is going to either need to come from, in the case of the water and sewer, from the rate structure, and in the case of other things that we want to do, it's going to come from general fund or other monies that we find for most of our capital project. And I do owe you all one apology. The funding structure for the cameras that were identified is actually a restricted fund from your PEG 1% funding. It is not a general fund, so when we talk about that, I just realized in the staff report we had identified when things were a general fund or other, and that one is not a general fund, so I apologize for any confusion that may have had.
Do you need any additional information from us tonight?
Nope, this is very helpful. This is what we were hoping to get and let you know that we're well immersed in the budget, and when you see some product coming back, it's going to reflect this policy guidance in the staff report, and that's where we'll pick it up. And I really would, I know that this is a new concept, so I apologize, but if you would, please send these, and I'd be happy to meet with anybody, and we could do these together, and I could, and part of this was also really to understand that there may be some difference of opinion on what's in that middle range or where levels are, and that's an important thing to kind of highlight when we show that, just like you had today in some of your policy discussion on wine tasting and RSC. There is some difference of opinion on a few things.
Can you send these to us electronically?
Be happy to.
Thank you.
Great, and with that, we are finished with item 10B, and I'm going to ask that we take a 5-minute break before we move on to item 10C. 5-minute break. 5 minutes. Okay, well, thank you all for coming back in a timely manner. We'll reconvene our meeting with item 10C, discussion on the Napa Pipe Development Project.
Thank you. A supplemental draft environmental impact report was issued for the proposed Napa Pipe project. There were some amendments to the project that warranted the report, and back on the original draft EIR, the council sent along a comment letter to the county back in January 19th of 2010, and this is another proposed letter that's an attachment to this brief report that covers some of the new, couple of the new aspects of the project, but it also reiterates the other points earlier made. The principal comment had to do with the water supply. They previously were proposing pumping groundwater to supply the project, and they've since amended the concept to send water through the North Bay Aqueduct from a water rights they own up in Tehama County. And we are, as has been pointed out elsewhere, commenting that American Canyon relies on that same pipe connection to the aqueduct, and that's a limited capacity. They were basing their numbers on a 2008 base of American Canyon, and we're also noting that during peak summer months for American Canyon, as water use increases, they would go to the well that they have and pump underground water to supply the project, and this is counter to the longstanding Napa County policy of not relying on groundwater for urban use. Also, as American Canyon further develops in the near future, over the next 20 years, the reliability and sustainability of sending water through that pipe, American Canyon may very well rely on its full capacity to supply their needs, and then that would put this project on groundwater all the time. The other 2 points that would have the most impact on our local interests here are they continue to impact road resources, road capacity, and the ability to get up valley. In about 13 major intersections that they would be contributing to a deterioration of level of service at those intersections that are already at D, E, and F, which are the lowest levels of service. And in some cases, they would be the cause of it slipping to the next lower level of service. And finally, governmental services, of course, they will be relying on sheriff services, as well as the point being made here, library services that will are spread fairly thin now and would potentially impact other users of that service, including Yountville. So this is the letter that is an attachment, if you endorse it, would be sent to the Director of Conservation Development Planning Department in Napa County.
Thank you very much. And just for new council and also for the public, as a reminder, we are not taking an official position for or against that project. What we're talking about here is highlighting impacts specific to Yountville and prioritizing those as they go through their environmental review and evaluate the project. So I think that's important that people understand that we're not for or against the plan, and that plan continues to evolve, which is why staff is evolving with it with these this recommendation. So thank you for bringing that forward. Questions of staff about the proposed letter? Any questions? No?
I do have
yeah,
one question.
Councilmember
I'm
Hall.
sorry. I mean, you use the language, or we use the language here, congestion at 13. But what is, I don't, sorry, it's in the first paragraph, regional traffic, the project's traffic generation will contribute to significant intersection congestion at 13 currently. I mean, are they like on 29, or I'm just trying to make sure, okay.
Yes, they're, and by the way, this is online, this supplemental draft EIR, and there's a kind of an executive summary in a matrix form that lists all of these intersections, all the way from 3rd Street Silverado Trail to Route 20, State Route 29 and Amola. It goes on Amola Avenue, Jefferson Street, Amola Soskell. There's
So it's all those, basically where all those things, where all the outlets of those individuals would be coming into potentially the visitor traffic that would make it to Yountville. Is that how we're positioning that?
yes,
Okay.
the traffic from this project would impact all of those intersections that are already poorly functioning
Got it.
as they exist.
Okay.
Any other questions?
No, thank you.
I'd like to offer the opportunity to the public to comment on this letter. Seeing no public, almost no public at all, I'll return the conversation then to council. Is there any specific comment from council on this letter? If there is general consensus that it's appropriate, we can just move forward with a recommendation. Councilmember Moeller.
I have several I'd like to discuss. Under the regional traffic intersection congestion impacts, either within this paragraph, I think we also need to address road improvements, because I think that we already know that there's a lot of streets that are stressed in terms of and needing repair in the city of Napa. And, this project is going to, in addition to going to the city of Napa, those NCTPA funds, it's even going to draw more NCTPA funds, which I think is going to have a direct impact on preventing our piece of the pie. So I'm not sure how we put that together, but, I think that we need to bring that up as well. That's one thought on the road improvements area. Another in that same paragraph, I think this is a very important piece, specifically as it relates to our community, Yountville, the very last sentence. Additional traffic congestion at key intersections will increase frustration for visitors and diminish the appeal of Napa Valley as a tourism destination. I would like to suggest that we have a very specific heading about, potential impacts on Yountville's economy. Our economy is 75% TOT and sales tax. I mean, we have a lot of congestion, and you can't get up, especially, people that come up from San Francisco or even on airports. If they can't get up here, it will be, as you kind of pointed out, I think too lightly, it will have a, potentially very negative impacts on our economy. If you can't get up here, and we are a tourism-based economy based on our financial numbers. So I would separate that out as almost a specific heading for Yountville tourism-based economy. Also, in terms of greenhouse gases, yes, automobiles play a role, but the additional structures are going to contribute significantly to greenhouse gases, and the structures going in are houses, a school, hotel. There's quite a few structures going in there, so I would suggest we beef that up and not just say primarily automobiles. In terms of government services, I would also add the school that they're planning on putting in. I think that they really need to examine that this school is potentially going on contaminated land, or the land that it's on could have very or more pronounced effects on school-age children than adults. Also, I think there's a financial impact with a new school on the whole financially stressed Napa Unified School District. And if that gets stressed even more, it's going to have direct impact even on our school. So I would try to start tailoring it, to a lot of specifics about Yountville in terms of the school. So the only last thing under floodplain, it said the potential effects to upstream property should be modeled and examined. I'd like to strengthen the word should. I think it's essential that if you're going to create all this new little city down in an area, the consequences of flooding on us, we need to know what that's going to be. So that would be my last comment.
Okay. And I'll respond to a couple of your comments first, if I may, and I guess I may because I may. I agree with your comments about adding road improvement or road damage, some language about the actual quality of the road surfaces, however staff feels it's appropriate, because that alone could have a negative impact on people coming to Yountville. So I would agree that additional language there would be appropriate. I disagree with highlighting Yountville specifically, because while what we're trying to do with this letter is target environmental impacts that impact Yountville, when we quantify it as purely in our best interest, I think it loses some of its impact valley-wide.
Well, I thought that was the goal. I misunderstood.
No, I think these are issues that impact Yountville, but we hope to get support to rectify the impacts throughout the entire community. So if we just say, because it hurts Yountville's tourism, I don't know that there'd be support for this negative impact on Yountville from other people that are deciding, other board supervisors that are deciding on this project. That would be my opinion. Going to the greenhouse gas emission comment, I would agree also, since we have determined in our own analysis of greenhouse gas emissions here in Yountville, structures have a higher impact than vehicle traffic. So I think adding, whether it be a few hundred or a couple thousand new structures as part of this project, it can't help but negatively impact the emissions throughout the valley. And as we also identified, some of those emissions that we're being held accountable for are outside of our immediate town limits, basically air quality. So I would agree that adding some reference to the impact of the additional structures be noted. I don't feel that school being built on contaminated soil has anything to do with Yountville. That clearly is under the scope of the general environmental impact report that will be required, and is something that the city of Napa should be most directly concerned with. I think at this point we should monitor the impacts to the school district. Certainly the expectation would be that whatever impacts they have financially, labor, staffing wise, they are going to have to mitigate those impacts. But I think that as we move forward, as the plans get more clearly defined, we should make sure that that's actually happening. There isn't any proposed negative impact on the school district yet that I've seen, and maybe there are some that are anticipated. So those are my comments. Other comments? Councilmember Dornbecker, do you have some
Yes.
feedback?
Under the water, first of all, I wanted to say I thought Councilmember Muller's comments were very good and yours too. And then I wanted to say that I thought under the water supply that it could be strengthened at the end where it says the use of groundwater would be incompatible with the county's policy that urban development should not rely on groundwater as the water supply is intended for agriculture and preservation of the Ide Preserve is, one of the key attractions of the Napa Valley. Or
So you're
considerations.
proposing adding language specific to preserving the agricultural
Yeah, the Ide
integrity?
Preserve. Otherwise, I thought all the comments were good.
On the issues that there's a little bit of disagreement as they were proposed by Councilmember Moeller, do you have a comment on should the impacts to Yountville's local economy be specifically addressed, or do you have a comment about the impacts on the construction of a school or the impacts on the school district as a whole?
Well, I think as a whole, rather than, I think that Councilmember Moeller just was, and I too sort of saw it as, how it impacts Yountville, but I do think that it's really Napa Valley-wide, the impact. So, but the schools and the state of the Napa Valley Unified School District funding and everything, I think it could be very detrimental to that too. So.
Okay, so we may want to consider some language related to that if the majority of the council agrees with that. Councilmember Hall, did you have some comments?
No, none specifically, other than I agree in general with the comments that have been made. We learned a little bit about this in the Watershed Information Conservation group that I'll talk about tonight, because they also talked about a letter going off to Napa Pipe and Hillary. So, in general, I agree with it. I think that the direction of what we're trying to present is correct. I agree with strengthening some of the language specifically as it relates to the water, because I think it is important. And again, also, I wasn't as familiar with GHG as everyone else in the room, it sounds like, but with the greenhouse gas emissions, I didn't realize that homes were much more significant of an impact. And so, to the extent that we can increase the language or strengthen the language around that, I would feel comfortable with that as well.
And that's specific to Yountville. I mean, if you're in an area that has a lower population density but higher transportation, that's different.
That makes sense, right.
Vice Mayor, I saved you for last because I know that in your reactions, it was clear that you had some points to make, so.
Imagine that. Imagine being all bent out of shape about a letter nobody will actually read. I actually did look at this very specifically as what affects Yountville. And I understand the idea of not being provincial, but I also think that if I'm jurisdictional, for us to get into issues that aren't our jurisdictional issue, I think is a problem. And I would back up on the school issue. I know somebody who's involved with the Napa Valley Unified School District, and trust me, they've made comments. So I don't personally, I understand the impact on our school here very well, but I don't think we need to reference that. The Napa Valley Unified School District, A, is the jurisdiction that should be, and B, trust me, they are. So I looked at it in that vein. I do think that the regional traffic and local economy, I had written in here that diminishes the appeal of the Napa Valley as a tourist destination, and I did say it affects all Napa Valley communities and their economies. So I think that sort of fits both ideas. It certainly would have an impact on us. I wanted to kind of point out that the project's reliance on groundwater would increase. I think it's an important distinction. We should never forget that we're an urban area, theoretically, and we have a well that would take groundwater in a situation that we needed it. To me, the real question about that change in their use is it reasonable to expect that they are going to use groundwater as their primary source? And I think the answer is yes, over time. I think that's kind of the argument you're making. I just want to be careful that we don't write a letter and say, how dare you drill a well for use for town water when we have a town well, and it's for emergency purposes, and we went through a lot of process to do that.
Well, let me also clarify a little bit, if I may, on why this policy question's there. Municipalities spend a lot more money on our current water conveyance than if we were able to use municipal wells. Mm-hmm. And one of the arguments that we're saying is, county, you can't change your longstanding policy just because you have a project that you want to benefit and you're going to put the straw down, because what we're politely saying is, if you're going to change the policy, the rest of us might want to use our straw as well, because most of us are sitting on very sound aquifers. It would be a much more reliable water supply source for us, and we would transition from an emergency well to having perhaps 2 municipal wells and less reliance on Rector Reservoir. Nothing, I'm just saying that's where the issue about longstanding policy comes into play, because our belief is that the county wants to basically potentially support a policy change that benefits this particular project, which happens to be about 3 times the size of Yountville.
Right. So I suggest that we be much more direct. Mm-hmm. I'm not saying we should be rude, but I think we should be more direct on that issue. I agree on the flooding issue. The greenhouse gas emission, you certainly made the comment that our Yountville inventory is structure-based, but that's because we have very little transportation going through Yountville. If you look at the county as a whole, transportation is number one. The argument can be made, and it's a sound argument, and I know there's some organizations who have supported Napa Pipe, that bringing people closer to the job centers means they drive less, and therefore you reduce greenhouse gases. So I am not real passionate about adding much to that item. And I do think that the governmental services should focus on the idea that the second sentence, the cost is unlikely to be offset by impact and development fees in the long term. What that tells me is there's going to be more stress on the Napa County Sheriff's Department. It's not going to pay for itself, and therefore everybody else who uses Napa County Sheriff is going to have to bear that cost, which to us is the increase in our fees from Napa County Sheriff. So I don't think it should be only Yountville, but that should be Napa County, Yountville. Are we the only ones who contract?
American Canyon.
American Canyon does, yeah. So throw American Canyon in there. Those are my comments.
And I'll follow up on one comment that related to the greenhouse gas emissions part. I think we're asking to make sure they recognize the impact of structures, not that they are the highest impact on greenhouse gas emissions, because we identified the impact on structural gas emissions. We want to make sure that that's being factored, as opposed to Napa County as a whole. Transportation is the higher impact, so they may not review the structural impact. So I think that's the intent. Bob, you can correct me if I'm misinterpreting that intent, but that's why I think and to your point of adding that in, we want to make sure they're identifying the impact, not that it's going to necessarily bump it up to the highest emission.
And we're supposed to be rolling back emissions, and this rolls them forward up significantly. So.
But to be fair, I think to the Vice Mayor's point that it is responding to the live and work in your area, so you're getting off of the highway. So again, I want to make sure that we avoid taking a political position on the elements of the project unless they have specific negative impacts that we can identify. So that's why, again, I hesitate to add anything about the school district as a whole or the site conditions in particular. Whether we want to talk about, I think Steve makes a good point about changing the system of water source, then may tap, everybody then could say, well, we want to have the cheaper alternative, which then would potentially destroy the agricultural water source.
And if I could, maybe Bob and I maybe should have explained a little bit about where we are in the EIR process. We're providing comments, and the obligation is that in their environmental impact report, the final one, they have to address the comments to some extent so that the decision maker, in this case the county, can show that either they've appropriately done that or the conditions that they may impose on the project will remedy that. So again, at this point, really what we're addressing is topic areas, not necessarily a position on them. We will still have the opportunity when we see a finished product to come respond and potentially take a position at that point in time, and that's, I'm just saying that's down the road, and that's a council policy decision, should you choose to do that based on an end product. But right now, all we're contributing to are impacts that need to be addressed in their final EIR.
Right. And as Bob pointed out, at least one or two of our original concerns has already been removed from the project, so we no longer need to worry about commenting down the road unless it comes back up. So what I would ask, if this is appropriate, Bob, is I see that you've listed here the comment period has been extended to May 2. If we can have you take this back, recraft language, and potentially put this on a consent calendar for the 19th of April so that we can see a revised final draft, is that appropriate?
It could be, or my real question would be, provided the feedback, if we make the changes consistent with your dialogue, do we have authorization to prepare the letter for the signature of the mayor? I mean, that would be staff's preference. If you actually all want to see the end product of the letter, we can put it back on the 19th. But I think you've got the basis of the letter, provided staff with some salient discussion point to draft. But that's your call on how you might choose to do that.
So I believe we need a motion then to accept, either to propose that we have this come back potentially as a consent item, or if somebody is comfortable that Bob can draft it as we've given him guidance, and the town manager and I review that document before putting signature on it. Either of those options, or not sending a letter at all is an option.
I'll move option number 2. That is, Bob makes the changes and the town manager and mayor review it. The mayor is the one signing it.
Fine with me.
I'll second.
So the vice mayor made the motion, and Councilmember Dornbecker seconded that. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you, and thank you, Bob, for staying proactive on that process. Moving on to item 10D, Sub-RENA Technical Body Appointment. Staff report. Bob, you're still up.
Thank you. This is the Sub-RENA effort by the county and the jurisdictions in Napa County to form up for the purposes of the 2014-2022 RENA cycle, to establish a subregion to where the allocation of the housing numbers would be performed at a more local level, and also set up a framework for swaps and trades of housing between jurisdictions. Part of that effort has to do with, there's a technical advisory body, which is staff members, and then there is a policy advisory board, which is comprised of decision makers. The city managers recommended that the mayor from each jurisdiction serve on the policy advisory board. However, the NCTPA board had no specific recommendation or specification for who served on it. In the case of, I pointed out, Napa County Board of Supervisors appointed, they designated the vice chair, Bill Dodd, to serve on it. Right now, there is no set schedule for this board to meet. That will be forthcoming, and the frequency of meetings is unknown at this point. So the request from staff is for the council to designate a delegate and an alternate.
And just to provide a little bit of update on that, because I have had conversations with, at least email exchanges with Supervisor Dodd and the staff related to this item, there is a meeting scheduled for next week, and then there have been proposed meetings each of the following months. So it would appear that it's possibly on a monthly basis right now. So with that staff report, are there any questions of staff? Is there a motion to be had? Vice Mayor?
The city managers seem to be very wise people. I don't know if you disagree with that.
I'll refuse comment on that item. Is there a motion or not to accept the recommendation? We would need to, if the motion is to appoint the mayor, we need to still designate a delegate as an alternate.
I also move that we take the recommendations of the city managers and ask Mayor Dunbar to be our representative on the Sabrina Committee.
I'll second.
And we need to identify alternate if we can in that same motion. So can we identify an alternate on the council?
Can we?
Even actually has, since there's been a second to the motion, do we need to accept that and do a second?
Okay.
If you wanted to, for example, amend your motion to have the vice mayor be the alternate, that would be one of your options.
And would it be one of my options if I wanted to put myself forward as the alternate?
That is an option.
Well, then I will amend my motion to say that I would like to take the advice of the city managers in appointing the mayor as the delegate to the Sabrina Committee and myself as the alternate.
Second.
There's been an amended motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? And I think we should document the first time that somebody's actually volunteered themselves to join in.
We'll make sure you get the agenda and the material for the next meeting.
Thank you.
And me too.
And thank you for volunteering, Councilmember Dornbecker. Moving on to 10E, OPEB Ad Hoc Subcommittee.
Similar theme to the last item you just had. This is consistent with the council's action when you provided direction on the establishment of the irrevocable trust. You requested that we establish a ad hoc committee to work with staff and to oversee some of the policy decisions and recommendations, and then ultimately be involved in drafting an annual report. And we will need to establish that committee in order to review and make some of the initial investment and program setup. So we're here requesting you to give us two people to serve in that capacity.
Any questions of staff on this item? And before we go to any recommendations, I did want to allow the public to chime in if they had any opinion about this. I could have done that on the last item and failed to do so. So anyway, moving right back on to, is there a motion for recommendation of two members to this ad hoc committee or discussion?
I have a question, if I can.
Please.
How often is I don't recall reading, is there an expectation for how often the ad hoc committee is going to meet?
I anticipate that this particular committee will meet a couple times initially as we're doing the program setup, and you'll have some more input while we're setting that. They're ready to go. We actually have, about 2 inches of draft stuff to go through. And then I would anticipate, they talked, as you recall, about doing a periodic, maybe twice a year check-in with us to talk about program performance and targets. And then I would imagine a meeting that may be a follow-up to one of those to draft the annual review that's going to come back to the council. So you're probably looking at 5 to 6 at the most, maybe this year, and then tapering down to 3 or 4 a year would be what I would anticipate going forward. And I may be a little high on the numbers. It depends on.
Are there any other questions before we move on? Seeing that it can be at the mayor's discretion how we staff this, I would make my own motion that we appoint Vice Mayor Chilton and Councilmember Hall to this ad hoc committee.
I'll second.
Oh, is that it?
That's it? All in favor of that motion?
Aye.
Aye. Enthusiastic, 5 yeses. Good, thank you, both of you, for being allowed to be volunteered to that item.
Thanks, Mayor.
Moving on to item 11, staff informational reports, water main leak on Landy Way. And if I could ask also if you could give a brief update on the Hopper Creek path reopening, just so everyone is aware of that situation.
The first informational report does deal with the initial water main rupture on Landy Way. As you know, subsequently there was a second water main rupture in the adjacent area. Staff evaluations determined that the pipe is stressed. I will point out that this particular pipe should not have failed. The life cycle for that section is still very young in its life cycle. We're evaluating what exactly that impact might have been and what caused that. And under the emergency provision of our purchasing ordinance, we've had to move forward with an emergency repair of the 200-foot section, which will be concluded tomorrow. The second question was the path, and I'm very pleased to report that the path is open. Gates are yet to be finally installed, and they may have actually went in late last week with the change in some good weather, but okay, then I'm just going to say they're the last element, but they're not stopping the path from being reopened. And then one last piece that I do want to share is the town of Yountville was profiled in Public Management magazine. I sent this to you earlier on a feature about how small communities work in a positive way. It's fairly substantial. This is the publication of the International City County Management Association, and this is actually the second time the town's activities we were profiled in the unique partnership approach in our community investment as an example of a small community with our pool previously. And this talks about a little bit of some of the things that we're doing in reference to some of our partnerships, sustainability, and what I like to call in some cases just using some common sense approach to some of the sustainability greenhouse things. And again, a credit to the council's policy. But also, you know, I think it does bode well for the town to be profiled, like I say, twice now in this particular professional journal.
Well done.
And just a follow-up question to your one informational report on the water main leak. One, do we have an estimated cost on that? And two, do we have any cost recovery update at this point, or is that still an ongoing part?
Target estimated, we're in the $40,000 range for this particular repair, and it will necessitate coming back. You will have on the 419 action confirming my determination that it's an emergency repair and needing to use our contract on-call, which we do have designated for an emergency, because normal standing purchase order authority that I have is $25,000, and normally we would have to do this on a competitive bid process. And obviously, when you have a number of residents without water service and a gaping hole in the street, that's not a necessity, the appropriate time to do a 45 to 60-day competitive bid process. Second answer to your question, I don't know enough yet. I do know that a pipeline that is less than 20 years old, that normally has a life expectancy of 60-plus years, should not have failed. I do not know enough forensic analysis as to why, but we will try to do a little homework to determine if there is any potential cost recovery from the original contractor and look at that. But I don't want to give you any false assurance that there is at this point. I'm going to assume there isn't, and then if I can find a way to address that, we will.
Great. And on behalf of the council, a thank you to the Public Works crews that not only once but twice had to be very quick and diligent in responding, getting water source available to the residents who were impacted. So thank you to all of those guys that. And, 1 o'clock in the morning, it seems to be the time that water mains rupture.
Attest to that. I also would like to express our appreciation to the residents that have been very cooperative in working with us and their adjacent neighbors who helped us to put together a bridge water supply system so that we're able to keep them. And clearly, this is not we want to do it right, and that's why we did some analysis and determined that just putting a localized fix did not look like the right solution, because it looked like it could add additional stress to another segment of the line, resulting in so we are replacing from a valve-to-valve location approximately 200 feet.
Great, thank you. Any specific questions or comments from the council about the staff reports? No? Very good.
If I could give one just very brief update on our online web payments, which we rolled out on March 1st, and then we had some technical difficulty and some downtime, and I want to let everyone out there know we're back up and running. We discovered what the problem was. I can't really describe it, only to say Springbrook admitted that there was a setting on our server that conflicted with the software, and they should have caught it sooner, but they figured it out now. We're moving along really well. We have a couple dozen people signed up for online bill pay, and it's working great, and we encourage everyone to go out and get signed up and use it. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that update. Without any additional, we'll move on to item 12, council member reports and comments. So we'll start first with reports. Do we have a report on LAFCO?
LAFCO met on Monday very quickly. The major item that transpired there was one of the Berryessa Resort Improvement Districts was reclassified as a community service district with an independently elected board of directors for their, speaking of water and sewer issues, they've got some serious ones. So that was a bill actually that was put forth through the state legislature and passed that allowed for that to happen. And now hopefully that community can kind of take its own responsibility for some of the issues they face in the future. I think they'll find some uncomfortable decisions to be made here pretty soon. So that was the major item before LAFCO.
Thank you. Napa County Transportation and Planning Agency postponed their meeting from this past week. So now you did you have a meeting since we last met, or you reported on that at the last meeting, right? Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So there'll be an upcoming report at the
last meeting. I think I was the only attendee there.
Yeah, that was, while you were gone, there was a meeting.
That's the one I was referring to.
Okay,
about. Yes. Okay, so if you have a report, Councilmember Mueller.
I think there was a lot of discussion about all the traffic congestion in American Canyon, and it was discovered that one of the relays that sets the lights to allow the east-west traffic was broken, and that's why there's been, and nobody really knew it. And so that is going to get fixed, and that really should have a major impact on Highway 29 going through there. I don't know if you travel that every day, but if you've seen anything like that, maybe you can comment on that. But that was supposed to be a major fix. And then there was a lot of discussion. There's some consultants that are going to be putting a lot of new computer information system on the buses that is going to allow them to figure out what buses are running empty, what buses are running over full, and that analysis, which will be done pretty shortly, is going to let them realign a lot of the bus routes, because some of the heavy routes, a lot of the complaints is that everyone sees an empty bus, but really there's a lot of buses that are over full and people can't get on them. So it really should have a major impact on the future of the bus system. And also not on the list is the Upper Valley Waste Management Agency. Should I talk about that too? I attended that on Monday, March 21st. A couple big things that they're dealing with is the introduction of Prop 26 last November, which says that you cannot charge a ratepayer a fee and then, for our payment monthly on our garbage, and use some of that to subsidize like other giveaway freebies, such as, the Napa Valley Wine Auction, they pick up all their garbage for free, or they use other nonprofits. They pick up their garbage for free. So based on Prop 26, you can no longer do that. You can't charge somebody for something that you give away free to somebody else. So there's going to be a new policy in place that when the rates change, that they will no longer be doing that. And speaking of rate changes, there's going to be discussion in the next month or two regarding a rate change for our trash system. So no Prop 218 system here because you have choices in terms of how you get rid of your garbage. I don't know what they are, but I guess you can take them down the landfill, but unlike water and sewer, so that's coming up. And also, they have been advertising in the Yountville Sun the last 2 weeks. Earth Day is this Saturday, April the 9th, from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. You can take all your electronic waste to the Napa Valley Museum and get rid of it. That's it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for
If
filling
I
in on
may,
that.
Actually, on that, I just want to,
Oh, yeah,
we've been
one.
in discussions, and it looks like the free community cleanup day, which has historically followed our community yard sale. Well, you know how some things have a natural life cycle? It looks like the community cleanup day is fading because, one, the funding structure from the franchise set aside to cover that is not adequate. And, you know, it would require about $7,000 from the town to continue to fund that at the level. So we are continuing to work to see if we may be able to, on another day, perhaps locate a dumpster at some location or something that people can come drop some stuff off to. But we will need to get some PR out there to let people know that the, you know, free community cleanup day is not happening. Also, I will share, I think Councilmember Moeller can attest, we've actually seen a trend in the last 3 years of considerably decreased utilization on that day. And it's a very expensive service because they bring all the trucks in and they staff and they go through the whole town, whether there's, you know, 35 people putting something out or 300 something. So that's just something, while Councilmember Moeller was making that, I wanted to share that we've been working with Upper Valley Waste, and probably not necessarily the best flow on their part of letting us know where we stand on funding that.
All the more reason for people with electronics to get them up to the museum on Sunday the 9th.
So just to follow up on that, I understand we've got about $3,500 or something about that left in that fund. Do we have a way to spend that money before it disappears?
Right, that's what I'm trying to work with them on such things like we could have our own community cleanup day, but it may need to be where we have a debris box, you know, a debris bin at a couple centralized locations and people bring it. So we're not going to leave the $3,500 on the table.
Thank you, Steve.
But we have to come up with a different mechanism of how to
Not
do
just
it.
going to throw it away?
No pun intended, yeah.
Yes, it was. Moving on, Councilmember Hall, do you have a report on Napa River Watershed Information Center?
I do. So I attended my first meeting on March 24th. It was very informative. Interestingly enough, a lot of the topic or discussion, in fact, both of the primary discussions were around groundwater. I'll just talk about those briefly. The first one was a discussion around the Board of Supervisors groundwater workshop, which occurred in February. Basically, it's just a discussion about that resource in Napa County. It was a data gathering, a monitoring session, if you will, but it was really to bring a common understanding to all the stakeholders about groundwater and the county's functions related to that water resource. So it was actually quite informative and something that when we look at Napa County as a whole, we're all tapping into I guess they determined between 8 and 10 different basins of groundwater that we're all tapping into. So it's a shared resource. The initial goal of this group was to understand the current historical condition based on the available data and to develop a data management system and recommendations for expanded monitoring. I'm not exactly sure what the expanded monitoring means today. They have a series of wells that they're actually doing monitoring on, and that's giving them the information they use for all the historical data. My expectation out of that discussion with the WIC was that they may be approaching municipalities about their municipal wells and usage and monitoring, et cetera. So to be, if we're not already involved, we may be in the not-too-distant future. Okay, so maybe we are already. Ultimately, though, what this is going to lead to, and something we need to be aware of, is that there will probably be groundwater ordinances that come out of this. If they're not already in process, they will be in process. It'll be revisions to the permitting processes and regulating use to promote the preservation of it. As we know, and as I'll talk about in the next discussion point, there's this inherent conflict between urban use and the ag. So they had, the second piece was a presentation, they called it, of the assessment of the feasibility of the collaborative groundwater data gathering effort in Napa County. They never have small or short, explanations to what these things are. They're really long. They tell you probably more than they need to in the topic title. But there was a really interesting presentation from a consultant who basically took the report that was done back in August of 2010. It is on the county's website if you're interested in reading it. It was pretty interesting. But it talked about the resource in Napa and that conflict. They'd gone out and done a survey of all the individuals or many individuals or stakeholders, and really were trying to learn about this shared resource with a focus towards looking how to evaluate and determine recycled water usage to reduce groundwater use across the county. There is ultimately, because we're all stakeholders in this, concern on the drawdown effects on the riparian and the aquatic habitats. So obviously with creeks here in the area, we need to be mindful of that. The conclusion or recommendation was that more studies obviously need to be convened. Sounds like any sort of process that goes on in the county, I guess. And that the effort for it to be successful needs to have a clear purpose, needs to have executive commitment, so local community involvement and political commitment, as well as transparency, because you got a lot of private landowners who are tapping into wells and they're not necessarily having to report because there's not a very good process or mechanism for how they track this. And of course, we're all drawing on the same water basin. So it was interesting for me. I hadn't ever been in a discussion of that ilk, specifically with groundwater, but now I feel enlightened. The last item or topic was a discussion regarding the San Francisco Bay Regional Water Quality Control Board's development of the vineyard facilities waste discharge requirement waiver. Again, far too long for one person to try to read. Basically, this is for vineyard owners to get a waiver to comply with CEQA, and I will be passing along some information to probably Graham or to Bob. I'm not exactly sure which of those parties, but there's an opportunity to submit comment. We should probably, it's not until later in May, but we should probably at least be, to the extent that we can, involved if we want to make or submit comment regarding this. The last comment on the WIC is that they are having the Napa County 2011 Watershed Symposium at the Yountville Community Center on May the 19th. It's going to be a hoot. So it will be there'll be two MCs, if you will, or people that are leading the effort. David Graves, if you don't know David, he's from Saintsbury, as a UC Santa Cruz graduate, really decent guy, but really involved with the community. And Kate Dargan. So I think it's going to be a fun event, but plan to be there. Thank you.
Great, thank you for that report. And I will give both a couple meeting reports and then some more general comments about events I attended, and then I'll follow up with any additional comments that the council has. The first is the Napa Valley Tourism Improvement District Yountville Committee. I attended my first time as the appointed representative here from the council, and we covered a number of items reviewing the Winterscape project and how that went and how that may be adjusted in the future. The same on the Movable Feast project, upcoming international industry event that's going to be coming up here later this year called the San Francisco Powwow, and how plans are being created to welcome many of those members and the media. Also, I just wanted to comment on, from Kathleen, our most recent Napa Valley Tourism Improvement District numbers, which are very encouraging and positive. Total assessments collected to date, 417,000 and change. With that, the Yountville allocation being a little over $104,000. So our local Yountville committee has been by far the most active and the most responsive in taking that money and doing good things to promote our community. So hats off to all the lodging industry, our town manager, and I appreciate Julie's staffing support also here from Yountville. So that's one meeting, one big thick meeting. Also, I attended the Yountville Arts Committee meeting last night, and just a couple highlights. We are starting a couple new programs. One is a book club, and I want to give a special thank you to Yountville resident Nancy Gates, who has agreed to volunteer to take kind of ownership of that effort. And also, we are going to hold a mystery writers panel on July 24th with 3 respected and well published writers, and they are Robert Degoni, John Lescroat, and Sheldon Siegel. There'll be more information coming up about that, but basically it's going to be here at the community center from 4:30 to 7:30, where there's going to be some book reading, signing, some other opportunities related to literacy and what it's like to be a novelist. So the Arts Committee is really doing some good things. We also got an update on the delivery of the Chaos Pamplona gifted sculpture that is due for official unveiling on July 16th, I believe it is. And also, let's see, I already listed July 24th, the writers panel. I think that covers that meeting for the most part. Moving on. Oh, one more thing I just wanted to recognize Gordon Huther, a local artist who has contributed 4 of his pieces to our public art walk in his catalog. A beautiful presentation of our art in Yountville. So if you happen by his website or his studio, we are well represented with our artwork from him. Also, quickly, I wanted to recognize a proclamation that was given by the city of Napa to the Vietnam Veterans of America on March 30th of this year. It was in response to President Obama having designated March 30th officially Welcome Home Day for the Vietnam Veterans of America. There was a very nice ceremony down at the Veterans Park in Napa, which I attended, and the mayor Mayor Tekel read a proclamation. Our local chapter 702, I believe, is our chapter of the Vietnam Veterans of America, put on the event. Alvin Bundy, among others. Al's a Yountville resident. Very moving and well-attended memorial for our Vietnam veterans. The last item, just a reminder in case folks weren't tuned in, at the beginning of the meeting, we had 4 members of the Allied Council here, and one of the highlights they wanted to let us know about was the unveiling of their new tree signage program. They're going to officially present that on Friday, April 15th at the north side of Section F building at 10:30. They have been, for months, they've been documenting the different species of trees and creating a signage system so that folks that are walking or riding bikes around campus can see what a really incredible tree system they have up there. So that's happening as well. Any comments from council members before we wrap up just before 10 o'clock?
I do.
Councilmember Dornbecker, yes.
Yes, please. I was involved in an event at the Napa Valley Opera House, and I wanted to let everyone know that Yountville was well represented. There are at least 2 people, one in this room and one in the other room, who were key players in that, and that is Samantha Holland Wagner was the volunteer coordinator, and this was to raise money for Iwanuma, the Napa sister city. The event did raise, well, at this point, it's raised $65,000. We put it together in 12 days, and it was a beautiful event with great taiko drum players and sword demonstrations, and the Vintage High School choir that was supposed to go to Iwanuma in May and sing, and obviously was not going to go, came instead and sang on the stage. And the other person I'd like to thank who's here this evening is James Raymond and Napa Valley TV. They came and did a beautiful production of the whole thing, and they are broadcasting it on Channel 28. I encourage you to look in on it. And we're still accepting donations to Kiwanis of Napa with Iwanuma in the memo if you want to contribute. But I wanted to thank Samantha and James and everybody involved. Also, thank you, Cindy Saucerman and the Yountville Chamber for loaning us some of the things we needed for the silent auction. And I did see our town manager there spending a lot of dough, so that was good. So it was a great event, and Yountville was well represented.
Thank you very much, and a great thank you to you and everyone else who put that event on, and to the community who really, once again, has shown their generosity when other people need that. The last thing I just wanted to acknowledge, it feels like it was a long time ago, but March 19th, Taste of Yountville. Obviously, the weather was not ideal, but it's still impressive. First of all, thank you to the Chamber of Commerce and to everyone that participated, the vendors that stuck it out. And also, it's impressive. We still had several thousand people come here throughout the day and enjoy not only the street fair, but then our restaurants and, in some cases, our lodging. So kudos to all that toughed it out. Fortunately, it's the aberration more than the rule in terms of weather like that. So we're looking forward to sunny. Actually, the Chamber has almost promised sunny, dry weather next year and for ever to come. So, but thank you all to that. And also, Vice Mayor, one more comment?
Very quickly, Saturday, April 16th, which is a week from this Saturday, 6 p.m. at the Community Center, is the revived Yountville Little League annual fundraiser. So tickets are available at I think the Chamber of Commerce for sure. I think also Ranch Market has them. So come out and support the Little League.
And speaking of Little League, I will be throwing out the first pitch this Saturday morning. So if folks are not already aware, please come out and support the Little League this Saturday. I know the colorful uniforms are already on display out here at Kennesaw Field, so must be springtime, whether the weather says so or not. With that, I believe we can move on to...
Do we need a motion to extend?
You'll need a motion to extend.
Not if we get through this in the next 3 minutes.
No, you will need for closed session. We
well,
have a brief closed session.
I'll enter a motion to extend beyond 10 o'clock.
Move to extend the meeting beyond 10 o'clock.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you for that. Moving on to item 13, future agenda items. We're looking forward to, again, the Allied Council being represented to give an update following their Allied Council meeting, Yountville Housing Authority annual report, and CAL FIRE and Sheriff quarterly safety updates. Are there any other future agenda items to identify? No? Then we'll move on to item 14, closed session. And do we anticipate any reportable action tonight?
We do not.
Thank you.